There's a kind of place up in these mountains that doesn't give things back. You drive right past it. A cove out on a lake, a bald up on a ridge, a hollow the road bends around for no reason anybody will say. They look like nothing. They look like the rest of it. But people work that country. Rangers, lookouts, surveyors, the ones whose job put them out on the mountain alone. And every so often one of them came up against something that wouldn't sit right. A head count that never came out even. A year that shows up in every tree. A cove where a scream doesn't carry. And when they carried it to somebody, when they tried to get it set down, it came back closed, handled, filed under the wrong word by nobody you could ever find. What follows is 10 of those. 10 accounts out of these mountains that the record never explained and never will. They don't get solved. That was never the kind of thing they were. They're just what gets into a person and doesn't leave. My father was a National Forest Ranger for 31 years, and in all that time, he never once took us camping. Not a single night. I didn't think that was strange growing up because when you're a child, your family is just the way things are, and ours was a family that spent no nights in the woods and never drove up a certain road and never said why. It was the summer after he died, going through his things, that I started to see the shape of it. And once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it, and what was underneath it was not an answer. There had never been an answer. Nobody would ever give one. And I had already begun, without ever once deciding to, doing the very same thing to my own family that he had done to us. His name was Sherman Reese, and he spent almost his whole working life in the mountains of North Georgia. In the Chattahoochee National Forest, up in Union and Lumpkin County country, around Blairsville and Suchas and Dahlonega, the southern tail end of the Blue Ridge where the Appalachian Trail starts its long run north. He was a ranger up there for 31 years, and there was nobody who knew that country better. He knew the creeks and the old logging grades and the gaps and the balds. He knew where the bears denned and where the trail washed out. He knew the names of all of it, Blood Mountain and Slaughter Gap and Duncan Ridge and Cooper Creek and Soseby Cove, the whole of it, like other men know the rooms of their house. He walked it and worked it and loved it, I think, as much as he loved anything, and he would not sleep a night in it, and there was one part of it he would not go into at all, and he arranged his entire life and ours so that he never had to. I want to say early that the country up there has old dark names for a reason, and that I know all the stories, because everybody who grows up around Blood Mountain knows them. They say there was a great battle up there long ago between the Cherokee and the Creek, and that the fighting was so terrible the ground ran red, and the gap below is called Slaughter Gap to this day. Those are real names on real maps, and it is a real old story. And I'm telling you about it now, only so I can tell you that it has nothing to do with my father. Whatever my father's was, it wasn't the battle, and it wasn't the legend, and it wasn't a thing you could look up. Everybody around there has heard the Blood Mountain stories, and they don't stop a soul from hiking it. Thousands go up it every year. My father's thing was smaller than a legend and more particular, and it was his, and it was in a specific place, and he never told one living person what it was. Not my mother, not any of us. He carried it 31 years and into the ground. There were 4 of us at home, my mother Beulah and my older brother Newt, and my sister Cleo, who's between us and me. We grew up in a plain frame house outside Blairsville, and it was, by every measure that showed on the outside, an ordinary happy family. My father was a good man, steady, quiet, well thought of. He wasn't strange. That's a thing I've had a hard time making people understand, because when I say all this, it sounds like I'm describing a haunted man in a story, and he wasn't. He laughed. He was kind. He went to work and came home and coached Newt's ball team and sat on the porch. If you'd met him, you'd never have known there was any hole in him at all. The hole was just so much a part of the shape of our life that none of us ever saw its edges, the way you don't see the edges of the yard you grew up in. It's just where the world is. The hole was this. We never camped. Never. My father, a ranger, a man of the woods, would not spend a night out in them, not with us, not ever. And if you'd asked him, he'd have laughed it off, said he got enough of the woods at work, said he liked his own bed, said any of the easy things a man says, and he said them so easily and so often that we grew up believing them. Other families camped. We drove home. However far it was, whatever the hour, we drove home, always, every time, to sleep under a roof. And there was a whole direction we never went. There was a part of that forest, up in the backcountry off the Duncan Ridge country, up above Cooper Creek in a stretch of hollows I'll just call the far side, because I still can't quite make myself write out exactly where, that my father never took us near, that he would drive an hour out of the way to avoid, that he steered every family outing, every drive, every trip, around, the way you'd steer a boat around a rock you can't see but know is there, and we never noticed, because how do you notice the road you never take? He died in the winter, 3 years back now, of the ordinary thing that takes men his age, and it was after that, cleaning out the house with Cleo, that I found the map, It was in his things, in a box of his old ranger gear he'd kept, and it was one of his own topographic maps of the district, an old one, worn soft, that he'd carried in the field for years. He'd marked it up the way a working ranger does, notes and dates, trails and drainages, all in his neat hand, the whole district covered in his marks. And there was one part of it that was blank. Not blank of terrain, the map showed the terrain, blank of his marks. That far side, that stretch of hollows above Cooper Creek. In the middle of a map he'd otherwise annotated to death was clean, untouched. 31 years of a man's notes all over that country, and a hole in them, an emptiness, the exact shape of the place we never went, as if his pen had refused to cross into it. I sat on the floor of that house and looked at it a long time, and Cleo came and looked over my shoulder, and neither of us said anything for a while, and then Cleo said, "Quiet," she said. "That's up past where he wouldn't take us." And I said, "I know." And that was the first time either of us had ever said, out loud in our whole lives, that there was a place he wouldn't take us. And we were grown women with families of our own, and we'd never once said it before, because you don't say the water's wet. So I started asking. That's the whole of what I did, if you want it plainly. My father was dead, and I had a question I'd never known I had, and I went looking for the answer, and this is the account of not finding it. I asked Cleo first, that day, everything she remembered. And Cleo remembered more than I did, being older, and she remembered a thing I didn't, which was the one time we almost went. She said it was when she was maybe 12, and I'd have been little, so I don't have it, but she does, clear. She said the family was up on a drive, a Sunday, and Daddy took a wrong turn somewhere, or a road was closed and he had to detour, and the detour was carrying us up toward the far side. Up that way? And she said she remembered him getting quieter and quieter as the road climbed, which none of us thought about at the time because he was a quiet man. And then, she said, he stopped the car, in the middle of the road. Just stopped it and sat there, both hands on the wheel, and my mother said something to him, and he didn't answer, and Cleo said she remembered being scared without knowing why, the way children get scared off their parents. And then my father put the car in reverse and backed all the way down that mountain road, a long way, backed it down instead of going up and turning around until he could get us headed back the other way, and he never said one word about it, and we went home, and it was never mentioned again. Cleo said she'd forgotten it for 30 years, and it came back to her whole the day we found that map. She said, I always thought he'd just missed a turn. She said, I never once thought it was that he couldn't go up there. And that's the thing about all this, that every piece of it had an ordinary explanation sitting right on top of it, ready, and we took the ordinary explanation every single time, our whole lives, because who wouldn't? Newt was harder to get to. He's up in Tennessee now, and we're not as close, but I called him, and Newt got quiet on the phone in a way that told me he knew exactly what I was asking before I'd finished asking it. And Newt gave me his piece, which was different from Cleo's and worse in its way. Newt said that when he was in high school, he'd wanted to do a backpacking trip with some friends up on the AT, up around Blood Mountain and Slaughter Gap, the ordinary thing boys up there do. And he'd asked Daddy, and he'd expected Daddy of all people to be glad of it, a ranger's son taking to the woods. And Newt said Daddy told him no, flat. And when Newt pushed, because Newt was 17 and it made no sense, Daddy told him he could hike it in the day, all he wanted. But he would not spend a night up there, and that was final. And there was no reason given, and no reason to be had. And Newt said Daddy's face when he said it was a face Newt had never seen on him before or after. Newt said, I asked him what the difference was, day or night. It's the same mountain. And he said Daddy looked at him and said, it's not the same at night. And that was all. It's not the same at night. And Newt, being 17 and angry, thought his father was just being unreasonable and controlling, and they had words about it. And Newt never did take that trip. And it was years, Newt told me, before he understood that his father hadn't been controlling at all, that his father had been afraid and had been trying, in the only way he could, without saying the thing he wouldn't say, to keep his son from something. Keep him from what? Newt didn't know. Neither of us knew. We still don't. My mother was the one I was most afraid to ask, and the one who knew the most, and the one who, in the end, gave me the least, because she didn't have it to give either. I went and sat with her, and I told her what Cleo and I had found, the map, and I told her Newt's story and Cleo's story, and I asked her straight, because she was 70-some and I might not get another chance. I asked her what happened to Daddy up there. And my mother, who had been married to that man for 44 years, looked at me for a long moment, and then she looked out the window and she told me the truth, which was that she didn't know. She said she'd been married to him longer than anybody, and she did not know, and that it had been the one closed door in the whole house of their marriage. And she'd made her peace with it a long time ago. She said it wasn't always there. She said when they married, early on, he was different. He'd take her up in the mountains. They'd camped even. Before us kids, she said. They'd camped plenty when they were young and courting and first married. He loved it. And then, she said, there was a stretch, back before Newt was born, when he was working out of a station up in that far country, up on the far side, for a while, a couple of years maybe, part of his job then, and something happened to him up there in those years. And he came out of it a man who would not go back. She couldn't tell me what. She said she'd asked him more than once in the early years, and that the asking hurt him so plainly, put such a thing in his face that she stopped, because she loved him, and she couldn't stand to do it to him. She said all she ever got in all those years was one time, once, early when she pressed him and he was tired and his guard was down, and he didn't tell her what happened, but he told her one thing about it, and she gave that one thing to me, and it's most of what I have, and it doesn't explain anything. She said he told her that the worst part wasn't what happened. She said he told her the worst part was that afterward nobody would talk about it, that he'd tried to report it or tried to get somebody to do something about it or tried to understand it. She wasn't even sure which, and that it had been, in his words, closed. That word, closed. That he'd taken it up the line to whoever was over him, the Forest Service, whatever office a ranger takes a thing to, and that it had come back down closed, handled, not a thing to be pursued, and that he'd been made to understand, not cruelly, just firmly, in the way those things are done, that he was to let it lie and not raise it again. And she said the thing that stayed with her 40 years, was that he told her he never could find out who had closed it, that there was no name on it, that he'd tried to find the person who'd made the decision, the man he could go to, and there wasn't one. It just came back closed from up above him somewhere, from an office or a person he could never quite reach, and that the not being able to find who'd done it, the facelessness of it, had been almost as bad as the thing itself, because it meant there was nobody to make it right and nowhere for it to go. And that was all my mother had in 44 years. Something happened, and then it was closed from above, by no one she could name, and he came home and made the rules and never spoke of it again. I could have stopped there. A wiser person probably would have. But I'd started, and I went looking for the records, because he'd been a government man, and government men leave paper. Most of it went nowhere, and I won't drag you through the offices and the waiting, but 2 things came back. The first was in his own service record, and it said, in the plain flat way a record says a thing, that my mother had the timing right. There was a stretch of about 2 years before my brother was born, when my father was assigned to a station up in that far back country, and at the end of it, he had asked for a transfer and gotten it, and moved down to the Blairsville side and never worked that district again, not in the 29 years that were left to him. A man who knew that country better than anyone, who never set foot in one piece of it again for the rest of his life by his own request. That much is written down, plain, and it says nothing, and it says everything. The second thing was that I couldn't find the first thing. Whatever had happened at that station in those 2 years, the paper for it was thin, where it had no business being thin, and where I could find any reference at all, it pointed to a report I couldn't get, or to a matter set down in one flat official word, an occurrence that had been reviewed and closed. That word again, closed. And when I tried to follow it up the way you'd follow anything, it did the exact thing my mother had said it did 40 years before. It came back closed from above, with no name on it, nobody I could go to, nowhere for it to land. Blame you couldn't look up. I had gone looking for the thing my father could never get anyone to answer for, and I found the same locked door he'd found, in the same place, still locked. I did find one man who might have known. There was a ranger, very old by the time I got to him, who'd been at that station with my father for part of those 2 years, and when I said my father's name and named the place, something came into his face, and he knew why I'd come before I said a word. But he wouldn't tell me. He said only that it had been a bad time up there, that Sherman had taken it harder than most, and that they'd all been told to put it behind them, and he had, and meant to keep it there. I pushed once, and he looked at me and said, "Honey, some things they close for a reason, and you ought to let this stay closed for your daddy's sake and your own." He passed not long after, I heard. He was the last soul alive who might have known, and he took it with him the way my father did. There was one more thing, and it's the last thing I have from my father's side of it, and then I have to tell you about my side, which is the part that actually frightens me. Near the end, when he was sick, in the last weeks, my father's mind wandered some, the way it does, and most of it was nothing, the ordinary drifting of a dying man. But there was one night I sat up with him, and he was mostly asleep, and he said some things that weren't to me, that were to somebody or something, in whatever he was moving through in his mind. And most of it I couldn't make out. But there was a stretch where he got agitated, and he said, clearer than he'd said anything in days, he said, "We don't go up there." He said it 2 or 3 times. "We don't go up there, we don't go up there," like he was telling somebody, warning somebody, or maybe just saying the rule, the family rule, the one rule of his whole life, saying it out of the very bottom of himself. And then he said one more thing, and then he was quiet, And I've never told anyone this part until now, and I'm still not certain I have it exactly right, because it was low and he was far away. He said, "They're still up there." That's what I think he said. They're still up there. And I don't know who they were. And I don't know what up there was in his mind at that moment, whether it was the far side or somewhere else, whether it was a memory or a fever. And I have never been able to decide whether those words meant anything at all, or were just the noise a mind makes going out. But I heard them, and I can't unhear them. And they are the closest thing to an explanation I will ever have, and they explain nothing. They're still up there. He died a few days after that. And it was the last thing about it he ever said, and it wasn't an answer. It was just a door he opened for 1 second onto a dark room and then closed again, forever. Now here's the part I have to tell you, and it's the reason I finally set all this down instead of leaving it be like everyone told me to. Somewhere in the middle of all this asking, this reconstructing, this chasing my dead father's fear back up the mountain, I realized that I had it too. I'd never seen it before because I'd never had reason to look at myself. But once I started looking at the shape of his life, I couldn't help seeing the shape of mine, and the shape of mine was the same shape. I've never taken my own family camping, not once. I have children of my own now, a family of my own. And I have never spent a night in the woods with them, and I never questioned it. We just don't, we're not campers. I've said it as easily and as often as my father said it, and I believed it just as completely, until I heard myself saying it, and heard my father's voice come out of my mouth. And there is a direction I don't go. I live within an hour of that country still, and I have never taken my children up toward the far side. And if you'd asked me why before this, I'd have said there's nothing up there. It's just backcountry, and we've got no reason to go, and that is exactly, word for word, near enough, the thing my father would have said, and I never knew where I'd gotten it. I got it from him. He handed it to me without ever telling me what it was, the way you'd hand someone a locked box and tell them to keep it and never say what's inside because you don't know either. You only know it's to be kept closed. He kept the fear, and he didn't keep the reason, and he gave me the fear and not the reason, because he didn't have the reason to give. It had been closed, from above, by no one 40 years ago, and all that was left to pass down was the keeping. And I have already started passing it down further. That's the thing that stops my breath in the middle of the night, since I understood it. My children don't camp and don't go up that way and don't know why, and one day they'll have children, and unless something breaks it, and I don't know how you break a thing you can't even name, they won't either, and it will go down and down. A family that will not sleep in the woods and will not go up a certain road. Generation after generation, each one steering around a rock they can't see. Each one giving the easy answer. We're just not campers. There's nothing up there. And not one of them will ever know that a man named Sherman Reese went up to a station on the far side of the Chattahoochee before any of them were born, and something happened to him that got closed by nobody, and that he came home and drew a hole in his map and lived his whole careful life around it and died with it inside him. And that everything they do without knowing why, they do because of that. The fear will outlive every last trace of the reason. It has almost outlived it now. In a way, it already has. I've thought about going up there myself, to the far side, to the station, to see, to break it maybe, to be the one who finally looks in the box. I think about it a lot. And I haven't gone, and I'm honest enough now to know I'm not going to, because I have his thing, whatever it is, in me, and it will not let me, any more than it would let him. And I feel it start up in me at just the thought. The same stillness Cleo saw come over him on that road, and I back down the mountain in my mind the way he backed the car down, and I go home, and I sleep under my roof, and I don't go up there. We don't go up there. I don't even know who they are. He never told us. His mother never knew, and mine didn't either, and the man who might have known said to let it stay closed, and then he died too. There's a hole in an old map the exact shape of a place, and a family that walks around it without looking down. And now that's me, and it's mine to hand on, and I don't know what it is. Some things get closed, and they stay closed, and they don't stop being there. The second core came out of a barn up in Madison County, and it had no business matching the first one at all. Nora Ledford had them both under the scope on the same afternoon. 2 thin cylinders of old chestnut wood no bigger round than a pencil, drilled out of 2 beams from 2 buildings 60 miles apart. And she was doing the ordinary work, counting the rings, lining the patterns up year to year. The first core was from a cabin down toward the Monongahela. The second was from the Madison County barn. 2 trees that had never stood within 100 miles of each other, grown on different mountains in different dirt, cut down probably 30 years apart. And when she slid the second one up alongside the first and started matching the rings, they fell into line the way they were supposed to, wide ears and narrow ears agreeing right down the row, which is normal. That's the whole science. Then she came to one ring, one single year, and it was wrong in both of them, wrong in exactly the same way. And she stopped, She'd seen it in the first core an hour before and hadn't thought much of it. A bad year, she'd figured. Now here it was again. In the second, identical, the same dark, collapsed band sitting in the same place in the row. And she sat there with her hand on the stage, and a thought came up slow and unwelcome. Two trees that had nothing in common had both written down the same thing in the same year, and she did not yet have the first idea what the thing was. I should tell you what her work actually was, because most people have never heard of it. And once you understand the tool, the rest of it gets under your skin the way it got under hers. It is a quiet tool. It was built to settle questions, not to raise them, and that is worth holding on to, because of what it ended up settling for Nora. Nora Ledford read tree rings for a living. There's a name for it, dendrochronology, and there's a small lab for it, tucked into a university over in the mountains, one of a handful of places in the whole region that did the work. The basic idea everybody knows. A tree lays down one ring a year. So you count the rings and you know its age. What makes it a real science is the next part, cross-dating. A wide ring is a good year, plenty of rain, plenty of growth. A narrow ring is a hard year, drought or cold. Every tree in a region lives through the same weather, so every tree writes down the same run of fat years and lean years, the same barcode, more or less, in its wood. So you take a piece of old wood you can't date, and you slide its pattern of wide and narrow rings against a master pattern until it locks in, and it tells you the exact calendar year of every ring in it, to the year. A beam in an old barn, and Nora could tell you the tree came down in the winter of 1911 and not be off by one. She had done that to thousands of pieces of wood, and she had never once been afraid of a ring. A ring is a fact, a plain, quiet fact you can trust, and trusting them had been the whole of her working life. That matters, because the woman at that bench the first winter, with the two cores that had no business matching, was not somebody hunting a ghost. She was somebody who'd found a lucky coincidence and was pleased about it. The reason cross-dating works at all comes down to a thing they call a marker year, or a pointer year. Every so often, something hits every tree in a whole region the same way in the same year, and it leaves a distinctive ring that turns up everywhere. A landmark, a brutal drought, a killing late frost that scars the wood while it's forming, a volcano on the far side of the world that throws up enough ash to run the summer cold across half a continent, so every tree that year lays down a thin, strange ring, and there it is, a fixed point you can find in any sample and pin your whole chronology to. Marker years are gifts. They are how you know you haven't fooled yourself. Find the same marker, in the same spot, in two samples that have nothing to do with each other, and that is the science confirming itself, the wood agreeing with the wood. That is supposed to be the reassuring part. That is the part that is supposed to tell you you're right. Nora had grown up in those mountains. She was mountain herself. Ledford's going back before the roads, and the wood she'd given her life to was chestnut, American chestnut. You have to understand what that tree was, because it's gone now and people forget it was ever anything, and its being gone is the floor this whole thing stands on. The American chestnut was the great tree of the Appalachian forest, not one tree among many, the tree. In a lot of these mountains, one of every 4 big trees in the woods was a chestnut, huge, straight, tall as a building, whole ridges of them, the backbone of the forest from Maine down into Georgia, and the heart of it was right here in the southern mountains where Nora worked. And it wasn't only a tree, it was the tree the whole mountain world was built on. Every fall the chestnuts dropped their nuts by the ton until the ground was covered. And people gathered them by the bushel and hauled them to town by the wagon load for real cash money in a place that had little of it, and turned their hogs loose in the woods to fatten on the mast. And the bears and the deer and the turkeys lived on it, and the wood was straight-grained and would not rot. So they built everything out of it, houses, barns, fence rails, coffins, and it lasted. A family could half live off the chestnuts. The whole rhythm of the year turned on them. And then, in the space of a single lifetime, every one of them died. It came from away. A fungus, a blight, carried in on some ornamental trees from across the ocean and first noticed up in New York in 1904, in the city at a zoo. Nobody in these mountains had ever heard of it, and it spread, slow at first, tree to tree, spore on the wind and on the birds' feet, working its way down the whole range. And it killed everything it touched. A tree would leaf out fine one spring, and by fall have an orange canker on the bark, and the canker would girdle a limb, and then the trunk, and the crown would die. And in a few years, the tree was a gray skeleton. It came down out of the north across the 20s and into the 30s, and finally reached the deep southern mountains, Nora's mountains. And by the time it had finished, near the middle of the century, it had killed something on the order of 3 or 4 billion trees. Billion. The dominant tree of the eastern forest, gone, functionally extinct in about 40 years. The old people had a name for the standing dead. They called it the ghost forest, whole mountainsides of bare gray chestnut skeletons, and Nora had grown up hearing about it from people who'd seen it. And she had handled what was left of it her entire career, because here is the thing about chestnut. It will not rot. The tree is gone from the woods, but its body is still all through these mountains, in the barns and the cabins, and the fence rails lying up in the weeds, holding up roofs right now. She had cored 1,000 pieces of it. She had lived her whole life in a country built out of a dead thing and never once thought of it that way. Not until the winter the marker came up, and after that she couldn't stop thinking of it that way. It never did get back to knot. That was her material. She was building a chestnut chronology, a master pattern of the old chestnut rings going back as far as the wood would let her, partly for the climate record locked up in it, partly just to date old buildings. And to do it, she went all over the mountains, coring chestnut wherever she could find it. A cabin in one county, a barn in another, a church, a run of fence rails, the beams in an old mill, and up in the national park, in the Smokies, over toward Cataloochee, preserved chestnut logs and old structures she could sample too. Every core a different tree, cut in a different decade, off a different mountain, hundreds of them over a couple of years. This is the thing to hold on to because the whole story turns on it. The entire point of her collection was that the trees had nothing to do with one another, scattered across the whole region, across half a century of cutting, grown in every kind of ground. The one thing they had in common was that they were all chestnut, and every one of them had the ring. She didn't see it all at once. The first afternoon with the Monongahela cabin and the Madison County barn, she thought it was a coincidence, a shared bad year, and she was mostly pleased because a shared marker is useful. It helps you cross-date. So she started using it. She'd get a new core, find that one dark collapsed ring, line everything up off of it, and it made her work faster. For a few weeks, she thought of it as a lucky marker year and nothing more. She even named it in her notes, just called it the marker. What made her look at it harder was that it was too good. A real marker year, a drought or a frost, it varies. It's strong in the trees that had it worst and weak in the trees on a wetter slope. And in some trees, off in a sheltered spot. It's barely there or not there at all. That's how weather works. It's uneven. This one wasn't uneven. It was exactly the same in every single core. Same darkness, same width, same collapsed, disordered look to the cells, whether the tree grew high or low, wet or dry, north slope or south, in the Smokies or over toward Mount Mitchell in the Black Mountains or down in the Monongahela. Identical. She started measuring it under high magnification, and it was not what a frost ring looks like, and it was not what a drought ring looks like, and it was not fire. There was no char. And it was not insects. There were no galleries, no tunnels. It was just a year where the wood came in wrong, dark and dense and disordered, the cells crushed and confused, as if the tree had tried to grow that year and something had gone through it and spoiled the work. And it was the same spoiling, to the cell, in trees that had never met. So she did what you do. She cross-dated the marker. She figured out what calendar year it was. It was 1904. She knew the year, of course. Anybody who studied chestnut knew it. 1904 is when the Blight was first found, up in New York at the zoo, and then it stopped making sense, and it never made sense again. Because in 1904, these trees were healthy. Not sick, not dying, not fighting anything off. Healthy. And that one plain fact takes the easy answer clean away. Because the easy answer is the Blight. And the Blight was not here in 1904. It was 1,000 miles off, in a city up north. One tree here and one tree there in a zoo, just getting started. It had not come near the southern mountains, and it would not come near them for 30 years. The fungus crawled, tree to tree, spore by spore, slow, and it took the better part of a generation to work its way down the range to where Nora's chestnuts grew. The trees in the Smokies. In the Monongahela, over on Mount Mitchell, most of them did not so much as meet it until the late 20s, the 30s. All through 1904, and for 2 and 3 decades after, they stood on their mountains, green and whole and untouched, 1,000 miles from the nearest sick tree. So when the year came up as 1904, Nora's first thought was the same one you probably just had. The Blight. The trees felt it coming and wrote it down. It held together for about a minute, and then she remembered where the Blight actually was in that year, 1,000 miles away and 30 years off, and that a tree cannot flinch from a thing that is not there. And whatever that dark, spoiled ring is, it is a flinch. It is the wood seizing up all at once in a single summer. The trees that did it were healthy. They would not be sick for another 20 and 30 years. They were healthy. And in the summer of 1904, something went through every one of them and marked them the same, and it was not the disease, because the disease had not come. And they all had the mark in 1904. The same year. All of them. The trees that wouldn't be infected until 1931, and the trees that wouldn't be infected until 1938, and the trees that got cut for a barn in 1920, while they were still green and living, every one of them carrying, in the ring for 1904, Identical dark spoiled band, as if in that one year, all across the whole range at once, hundreds of miles apart, in trees still decades from any sickness, every chestnut in the mountains had registered the same thing in the same summer. Whatever put that mark there in 1904, it wasn't the fungus. The fungus was too far away and moved too slow. Whatever it was, reached every chestnut in the southern Appalachians in a single growing season, faster than the disease that would eventually kill them years ahead of it, and left the same signature in all of them, and then went quiet. And the trees stood there, marked for another 20 or 30 years before the visible dying ever started. She checked it every way she knew how. That's the part I want to do justice to. Because Nora was not a dramatic person, and she did not want a ghost story. She wanted an ordinary answer, and she went after one hard. She looked for a climate event. If it was a drought, or a frost, or a cold volcanic summer, there would be a record, and there would be a fingerprint in the wider science. There was nothing. 1904 was not a notable drought year in the southern mountains. Not a killing frost year, not a known volcanic year. The weather that summer, as near as anyone had it, was unremarkable. Nothing in the sky, nothing in the record to make every chestnut for hundreds of miles come in wrong at once. Then she did the thing that should have settled it and instead made it worse. If it was weather, any weather at all, it would have hit the other trees too. Oaks and hickories and pines were growing right there in the same woods, in the same soil, under the same sky, and they lay down rings the same as the chestnuts do. So she pulled every non-chestnut sample the lab had from those same forests, oaks and pines and hickories from the same mountains, and she went to their 1904 rings. Nothing. The oaks were fine in 1904, the pines were fine, the hickories were fine, a perfectly ordinary ring, all of them. Whatever went through the woods in 1904 and spoiled the chestnut wood did not touch a single other kind of tree. It reached across the whole range and it found the chestnuts, and only the chestnuts, every one of them, and left the rest of the forest alone. A thing that hits one species and no other, everywhere in its range, in the same year, matching no weather, matching no known event, decades ahead of the disease that would kill it. She had it in front of her in the wood, in hundreds of independent samples, measured, dated, confirmed by the very cross-dating that was supposed to reassure her, and there was no cause for it that she could find or name or even imagine. That was about when she went to see Ambrose Church. She'd been told about him by a colleague and by an old salvage man too, and I'll get to the salvage man. But Ambrose was the one she went to first, because Ambrose was old enough to remember. He was up past 90. He wasn't sure of the exact figure himself, living out on a place his family had held for generations up a hollow in the mountains, and he was one of the last living people who had any first-hand memory of the chestnuts at all, who'd been a boy when the last of them were dying. She went to ask him about the timeline, the ordinary questions. When did the trees die where he was? Did his people gather nuts? That kind of thing. She did not go up there to hear what she heard. She asked him about the chestnuts, and he was quiet a while, the way old people are quiet before a big thing. And then he told her the first thing he told her, which she said she carried around for a long time after. He said the thing he remembered about the chestnuts wasn't how they looked, it was how they sounded. He said when the chestnuts bloomed in the early summer, the whole mountain went white, the ridges white as if it had snowed in June, every tree covered in bloom, and the sound. He said, you cannot imagine the sound. The bees. Every bloom on every tree working with bees, whole mountainsides of them, and the whole ridge would hum, a low roar you could hear from a long way off, the mountain itself humming for a couple of weeks every summer. And in the fall, he said, when the nuts came down, they came down like rain. All day and all night you could hear them dropping and rolling, a steady patter over the whole woods, and the animals in under the trees, the hogs and the turkeys and the squirrels, all of them at it. He said the woods were loud then. He said people who never heard it wouldn't believe how loud a living thing the woods used to be. Now some of that, Nora understood, was Ambrose remembering his own grandfather more than remembering himself, because the great bloom and the great mast were mostly gone by the time he was old enough to know, the trees already sick or dead in his boyhood. He was passing along what the old ones had passed to him, mixed in with the little he'd caught himself at the tail end. But then he told her the other thing, and this was his own, and this was the thing that made her go still. He said his grandfather always told it that the chestnuts didn't die the way people thought. People thought they died slow, over years, the cankers and the gray skeletons, and that was true enough. For the wood, the bodies took years to die, but his grandfather said the life went out of them all at once, 1 year before ever a canker showed. He said the old people up in these mountains marked it not by the dying trees, but by a summer, one particular summer when the woods went quiet. Just quiet. He couldn't put a year on it, and neither could his grandfather exactly. It was a long time back, before the sickness ever came down this far. But the old ones said there was a summer when the bees came to the bloom, and the bloom wasn't right, and the hum was thin, and the mast that fall was poor, and it was like, his grandfather said, it was like the trees had heard something coming and quit. Given up. Years before they showed a mark, years before the blight was ever seen in these parts, the old people said the chestnuts knew, that there was a year the chestnuts heard it coming and went silent, and after that they were only standing there dead on their feet waiting for the sickness to make it official. Nora didn't tell Ambrose about the marker. She said she didn't have the heart to, or maybe the nerve. But she drove down out of that hollow with an old man's folk memory of a silent summer sitting right on top of her scientific fact of a spoiled ring in 1904, in trees that wouldn't be sick for 30 years, and the two of them fit together in a way she did not want them to fit, and could not make stop fitting. She kept working. What else do you do? And now she could not see it. Every new chestnut core, the mark was there, 1904, identical, and she'd catch herself finding it first before she even started the real counting, her eye going straight to it. She sampled more widely, partly hoping to find a chestnut that didn't have it, one clean tree that would break the pattern and let her call the whole thing a lab artifact and go back to sleep. She never found one. Every chestnut she read carried 1904 spoiled the same way. She got the last of the wood, some of it from a man named Roscoe Whitaker, who was old too. Not as old as Ambrose, but old, and who'd made his living in his younger years salvaging dead chestnut off the mountains, cutting the gray standing snags for their lumber, wormy chestnut it was called by then because the dead trees got bored full of insect holes before they were cut. And it was prized. People paid for the look of it. Roscoe had a barn and a shed full of chestnut, old salvaged stock, boards and beams from God knew how many different dead trees off God knew how many different ridges, cut across decades. It was the most scattered, unrelated pile of chestnut she could have asked for. 100 different trees with nothing in common but their species and their deadness. And she cored a great deal of it, and every board had 1904 in it. Spoiled, identical, whether the tree it came from had grown 40 miles east or 40 miles west, whether it had been cut in 1935 or 1955. Roscoe watched her do it, and he asked her what she was finding, and she told him she was just dating the wood, and he said something she wrote down. He said his daddy always said you could tell chestnut from any other wood blind, in the dark, by feel, because chestnut had a bad year in it that no other wood had. A place where the grain went ugly and every board of it had the same ugly place, and his daddy called it the tree's scar and said they all got it the same year, all of them, before they died, and nobody ever knew why. Roscoe said he'd handled chestnut his whole life, and he knew the place his daddy meant, the ugly year, and he could find it in any board without looking. He thought it was just a thing about chestnut. He didn't know it was a date. He didn't know it was 1904. He just knew it was in all of them, the same, the trees, scar, and that his daddy before him had known it too and hadn't been able to explain it either. She tried to take it further, and that's where the doors started closing, softly, the way they do. She wanted to publish, or at least to pursue it properly, and she needed help and funding and access to more data than the little lab had. And every place she took it, the answer came back the same, in different words. Contamination. Artifact. Some flaw in her preparation or her sampling that she wasn't seeing. When she pushed back, when she pointed out that hundreds of independent samples from independent trees couldn't all be the same lab error, the answer softened into something more like advice. A senior person she trusted, someone up the chain whose name she wouldn't give me, told her plainly to let it go. He said, use it as a marker. It's a good marker. It dates beautifully. Use it and be grateful and don't chase what makes it. He said chasing it would make her look unserious, and there wasn't grant money in a spoiled ring nobody could explain, and there wasn't a career in it either, and he was probably right about all of that. That was the closest thing to an authority anybody ever gave her on it, and it wasn't an answer. It was a door being closed politely from the far side, a decision made somewhere above her that this was not a thing to be looked into, and she never did find out whether that was because there was nothing there or because there was. Her colleague, Della Sexton, who worked the bench next to her and was the only person she told the whole of it to, took it seriously at least. Della checked Nora's dating herself, independently, on a batch of the cores, and got 1904 every time, the same spoiled ring, and confirmed the other species were clean. Della didn't have an explanation either, but Della was the one who found the last sample, the one that took the floor out from under both of them, and I'll end on that, because Nora did too, in a way. That's where she stopped. There had been an argument between them, a scientific one, about whether the mark might somehow have to do with the forest itself, the trees standing together, some signal passing tree to tree through the connected root systems the way trees do, share things underground, a thing that could in theory move through a stand of chestnut all growing together. It was a stretch, but it was at least a natural idea, and it would have needed the trees to be in a forest, touching, connected. So Della went looking for a chestnut that had grown alone, cut off. No forest, no neighbors, no shared roots. And she found one. There had been a big chestnut planted long ago as a shade tree in a yard down in a town, an ornamental, all by itself, No other chestnut for miles, a lone tree in a lawn that had died of the blight like all the rest and been cut, and a piece of it had been kept. One tree, grown up entirely alone, connected to nothing, sharing roots with nothing, hundreds of trees worth of distance from the nearest forest chestnut. It had the mark. 1904. Spoiled. Identical to all the others, to the cell. A single chestnut, standing alone in a town lawn, touching no other tree, wrote down the same thing in the same year as every chestnut in the mountains. Whatever went through them in 1904 didn't need the forest to carry it. It didn't pass tree to tree. It reached every chestnut, the ones in the deep woods and the one lonesome tree in a yard, all at once, all the same, in a year when they were all still healthy, decades before the disease, matching no weather, sparing every other kind of tree, and leaving no explanation of any kind. That's the whole of it. That's where it stays. There's no answer at the end of this. Nora looked as hard as anyone could look, and there is a spoiled ring in every piece of American chestnut wood, dated to 1904, and nobody can tell you what made it. She's still at the lab, or she was last I knew. But she told me she doesn't work the chestnut anymore, doesn't take the cores, handed that part of it off, and when a piece of chestnut comes across her bench for something else, she deals with it fast, and doesn't linger on the 1904 ring. Doesn't put it under the high magnification, just gets it done. She said the thing that got her, in the end, wasn't the mystery of it. She could live with a mystery. It was after Ambrose. It was that she couldn't stop hearing how quiet the woods are now. She'd never noticed it before he said it. The mountains she grew up in that she'd walked her whole life. And it took a man past 90 telling her about a sound she'd never heard to make her realize the woods around her are silent, that the great humming and the rain of falling nuts are gone and have been gone since before she was born, that she'd been walking around all her life in the after of something and never once heard the quiet of it. And now she can't stop hearing it. She said, "You go up on a ridge in June, where the whole mountain used to roar with bees, and there's nothing, just wind. And once you know that, once somebody tells you what used to be there, you can't ever again walk in those woods and think they're only peaceful." She said now they just sound like something left. Every board of chestnut in these mountains has the same bad year in it, down at the bottom in 1904, and the trees stood healthy for 30 years after they wrote it. Nobody knows what they were writing down. The old people said the chestnuts heard it coming. That's not an answer. It's just the only thing anybody ever said. Isaac Ledbetter stood in the door of his own house and told Enoch Rathbone that he couldn't leave. And Rathbone, who by the spring of 1934 had heard every version of that sentence there was to hear, thought he knew which version this one was. He'd stood in 100 doorways by then, and 100 men had told him they couldn't leave. And every one of them had meant that they didn't want to, that it was killing them, that the place was the only thing they had. And every one of them had left, because they had to, because it wasn't up to them, and it wasn't up to Rathbone either. So when Isaac Ledbetter said he couldn't leave, Rathbone said the thing he always said, quiet, that he was sorry, that it was out of everybody's hands now. And Isaac looked at him a long moment and said, "No, you don't hear me. I can't leave. Somebody's got to be here." And Rathbone wrote it down as more of the same and went on to the next family, and it was years before he understood that it hadn't been the same at all. That, of all the men who ever stood in a doorway and told Enoch Rathbone they couldn't leave, Isaac Ledbetter was the only one who'd been telling him the plain truth. The job Rathbone had was one of the saddest jobs the government ever handed a man, and for a long time he thought the sadness of it was the worst thing about it. It took him most of his life to understand it wasn't. He was a relocation agent. In the early 1930s, they were making a national park out of the Blue Ridge of Virginia, the long mountains that run down the eastern edge of the Shenandoah Valley, the country above Luray and Sperryville, up over toward Madison and Rappahannock and Page counties, the high ridges where Skyline Drive runs today and where the tourists go now to see the overlooks. That's Shenandoah National Park. And to make it, they had to empty it, because people lived up there. Had lived up there for 150 years and more, mountain families back in the hollows, farming the steep ground, running a few animals, cutting timber, getting by the way people got by in those mountains, poor by the standards of the valley, but rooted, generations deep in the ground. And the park could not have them in it. A national park is supposed to be wilderness, empty, and so the families had to go, all of them, every hollow, and the state of Virginia took the land by condemnation, by eminent domain, whether a family wanted to sell or not, and paid them what the appraiser said it was worth, which was never much, and moved them out. Somewhere around 500 families, all told, over those years. And Enoch Rathbone was one of the men who did the moving. He tried to be fair to them, in a job that didn't leave much room for it. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a valley man, educated, hired on by the state because he could read a deed and talk to people, and he took the work, he always said, partly because he needed it in those hard years, and partly because he told himself that if it had to be done, better a man who'd be decent about it than one who wouldn't. And he was decent about it, as far as the thing allowed. He'd go up into a hollow to a family's place, and he'd appraise the land and the buildings, and he'd sit at their table and explain what was happening, that the park was coming, that they'd have to go, that there'd be money, some money, and in some cases, a new place, one of the resettlement homesteads the government built down in the valley for them. And he'd handle the paperwork and set the date, and when the date came, he'd see them out. And then, after they were gone, the crews would come, the CCC boys mostly, and they'd burn the cabins. That was the practice. You didn't leave the houses standing because people would come back, or squatters would move in, so once a family was out, the house came down, usually by fire, and the fields were left to go back to woods. Rathbone saw a lot of houses burn. He said you never got used to it, watching a family's whole history go up in an afternoon. The house their grandfather built, and the family standing down on the road watching it burn if they hadn't already gone. And then nothing there but a stone chimney standing in a clearing that the forest would take back inside of 10 years. And here's the thing that shaped how Rathbone saw all of it, and it matters. Because it's the reason he did what he did without ever once stopping to wonder if he should. In those years, the mountain people were spoken of, by the valley and by the state and by the men who wrote the reports that justified the whole business, as backward, ignorant. There were surveys done, and there was a book that came out about the hollow folk right around then, and it painted them as a people cut off from the world, degenerate almost, superstitious, hardly civilized, children who needed to be brought down out of the mountains for their own good. That was the story everybody told about them, and Rathbone, decent as he was, had breathed that story in like everybody else. So when a mountain family did or said something he didn't understand, his first thought, always, the automatic thought of his whole class and time, was that it was ignorance, superstition, the quaint, dark notions of a backward people. He didn't hold it against them exactly. He pitied it. And that pity, that easy pity, was the thing that let him walk right past the truth every single time it was put in front of him. Because most of the families grieved the ordinary way, and the ordinary way he understood. They didn't want to go, they fought the price, they cried, they cursed the government, they left broken, and all of that made sense to him. It was the sense of a poor family losing everything, and it broke his heart, the ordinary amount. But there were a few families that didn't grieve the ordinary way, a few that resisted in a way that was different, and it took Rathbone a while to even notice the difference and longer to feel it, and years to understand it. The Ledbetters were the clearest of them. They lived far back, up a deep hollow under Robertson Mountain, over toward the old rag country, a place I'll call Sable Hollow, which was the last hollow up that particular drainage, remote even for that country, a good hard climb up from any road. Isaac Ledbetter and his wife Delphia, and some of their kin around them, an old family, back in that hollow longer than anybody could say. And when Rathbone came to move them, they resisted, but not the way the others resisted. They didn't argue the price. They didn't seem to care about the money at all, which was strange in itself because everybody cared about the money. It was all they'd have. The Ledbetters cared about staying. And not about staying the way a man cares about his home, but about staying the way a man cares about a job he's responsible for and can't walk off of. That was the quality of it, and Rathbone felt it before he could name it. Isaac kept saying somebody had to be there. Not we love it here, not this is our home, though surely those were true too. Somebody's got to be here, as if the hollow needed a person in it, as if their being there was doing something, and if they left, that something would stop being done. Delphia Ledbetter said it plainer once, and Rathbone remembered it because it made no sense to him and stuck the way senseless things do. He was at their place, going over the papers, and Delphia, who mostly stayed quiet and let Isaac talk, said to him, out of nowhere, she said, "You think we're holding on?" And Rathbone said something gentle about how he understood how hard it was to let go of a home. And Delphia said, "No, we ain't holding on. We're holding down." And she wouldn't say anything more about it, and Rathbone wrote it off, the way he wrote all of it off, as the strange, sad talk of a mountain woman losing her home, poor thing, and moved on. We're not holding on. We're holding down. He would think about those 5 words for the rest of his life. There were others like the Ledbetters, and this is the part that Rathbone only saw as a pattern much later, when he laid the whole thing out in his mind. There was a family named Cold Iron, up another hollow, and old Virgie Cold Iron, the mother of them, resisted the same peculiar way, with that same dutiful place-bound refusal that had nothing of the ordinary grief in it. And there was a family named Buchanan, up a third hollow. Same thing. It wasn't every family. It was a few, scattered, each far back in its own deep hollow, each the oldest family in its particular place, and each one resisting not like people losing a home, but like people being pulled off a post they'd been set to guard. And every one of them, when Rathbone thought back on it, had said some version of the same thing. Somebody's got to stay. You don't want this place empty. It's not ours to leave. And every one of them had been dismissed by Rathbone and by everybody as more mountain superstition, the backward notions of the hollow folk, nothing a reasonable man needed to take seriously. Virgie Cold Iron gave him the clearest warning, and he dismissed that too. She was old, and when her time came to be moved, she didn't fight it with lawyers or with the price. She fought it by trying to tell Rathbone something, and she got as close to telling him plainly as any of them ever did. She told him that her people had been in that hollow since before the country was a country, and that they had stayed there, always, through everything. And that there was a reason they'd stayed and never left, not in droughts and not in hard winters, and not when the young ones wanted to go down to the valley for the mills. That somebody of them had always stayed on purpose because the hollow was not to be left empty, and that if the government emptied it, emptied all of them, took every family out of every hollow so there wasn't a soul left up in those mountains, then, she said, and here she looked at him hard, then it wouldn't be the government's to fix, and it wouldn't be hers either, and God help whoever was up there when it came unheld. Rathbone remembered every word, and it moved him not at all at the time, because it was, to his ear, exactly the kind of thing the reports had told him to expect. Ignorant, dark, superstitious. The mind of a people who'd been too long alone in the hills. He was kind to her about it. He said something soothing. And he moved her out on schedule, and the CCC burned her cabin, and he went on to the next hollow, and he never once, not for a second, considered that the old woman might simply have been telling him a true thing in the only words she had for it. The mandate to do all this, I should say, came from nowhere Rathbone could ever have pointed to, and that's a thing he held on to later, bitterly. He was the man at the door, the face of it, the one the family saw and hated and begged, but he hadn't decided any of it. The decision to make the park was made in Richmond and in Washington, in offices, by men he never met. The condemnations were the state's. The appraisals came down from above him. The line of what was in the park and what was out was drawn by somebody in a room somewhere. He was the instrument, and he knew it, and he'd tell the families so that it was out of his hands, and it was true. And it was also, he came to feel, the most cowardly true thing a man could say, because it meant that the thing was being done by everyone and by no one, that there was no single person anywhere who had chosen it and could be made to answer for it. And so, when it turned out to have been a catastrophe, there was nobody to bring the catastrophe to. It had come from above, from all of them and none of them. There was no door Rathbone could go stand in and say, "Look what we've done, undo it." That was the whole horror of how it was done. It was nobody's fault, and so it could not be stopped and it could not be fixed. He moved the Ledbetters last of the families in that whole district, partly because Sable Hollow was the hardest to get to, and partly, he admitted, because he'd been putting it off, because Isaac and Delphia unsettled him in a way he didn't examine. And when the day finally came, it was as hard a day as he had in all those years. The Ledbetters would not leave on their own. He'd set the date, and the date came, and they were still there, and it went past persuading into the thing it always finally became, which was force. The sheriff's men, the deputies, a wagon, the family's things, carried out whether they carried them or not. Rathbone hated those days more than anything in his life, and the Ledbetters didn't fight the men, didn't struggle, there was no violence in them, they just would not help. They stood and watched their things be carried out, and Isaac said, over and over, quiet. Not to Rathbone exactly, not to anybody. Somebody's got to be here. Somebody's got to be here, like a man watching a fire he can't put out. And at the end, when it was done, when the wagon was loaded and the family was to go down the mountain and the crew was waiting to fire the cabin, Delphia Ledbetter stopped in front of Rathbone, and she wasn't crying. None of them were crying. And she said to him the last thing any of them ever said to him, and it wasn't a curse and it wasn't a plea. It was almost gentle, almost pitying, which was worse. She said, "Well, now there's nobody holding it." And she walked down the mountain behind the wagon, and Rathbone never saw her again. And the crew burned the cabin, and the chimney stood there in the clearing the way they all did. And Sable Hollow was empty for the first time in 150 years. And Rathbone thought that was the end of it, the sad, ordinary end of a sad job. It was months before the reports started to reach him that made him think it wasn't. They came in sideways, the way that kind of thing does. The CCC was working all through those mountains then, building the Skyline Drive, cutting the trails, and the crews got to know the country. And Rathbone started to hear, first as a joke, then as something less like a joke, that the boys wouldn't work certain hollows, wouldn't camp in them. There was a hollow up under Robertson Mountain, one of the crew foremen told him, that the men flat wouldn't go up, that they'd found reasons not to run the trail work up into. And when Rathbone asked which hollow, it was Sable Hollow, the Ledbetters' hollow, and the foreman didn't know why the men wouldn't go up it. They just wouldn't. Said it wasn't right up there. Said the emptiness of it wasn't like the emptiness of the other emptied hollows, and the men had quietly agreed among themselves to leave it be. Rathbone filed that away. Then he heard something similar about the Cold Iron Hollow, then the Buchanan Hollow. The same three. The three families that had resisted the peculiar way, the guardian way, the holding down way, and now the three emptied hollows that the living wouldn't go into. He noticed the pattern, and he told himself it was coincidence, that word again, the word men used to keep a door shut, and for a while he managed it. The reports got worse and less deniable over the next year or two, and they reached him the way all of it reached him, third hand, unconfirmed, because nothing about this was ever anything you could pin down. A survey party that went up one of those hollows and came back early and wouldn't say much, only that they'd finished quicker than expected, which nobody who knew that ground believed. A ranger, once the park was up and running, who was said to have gone up into the cold iron hollow after some report or other and come back and asked, quietly, to be assigned elsewhere, and got his transfer, and never talked about why. And under all of it, in every version, the same word the CCC foreman had used, that it wasn't right up there, that the emptiness of those particular hollows was a different kind of emptiness than the emptiness of all the other hollows the park had made, and that the difference was not a thing anyone could describe, and not a thing anyone would stay to study. Nothing ever happened that you could write down. That's what I have to be honest about, the same as Rathbone was honest about it. Nobody died. Nobody vanished that he ever knew of. There was no event, no body, no proof of anything. There was only a growing agreement among the people who worked and hunted and lived around those mountains that three particular hollows were to be left alone, and a growing dread in Enoch Rathbone as he understood that those three hollows were the three he'd emptied of the families who'd told him, each in their own words, that the hollows were not to be emptied. That was all, and it was enough. It was more than enough for him, because he'd put it together by then, the thing Delphia had handed him and he'd thrown away. We're not holding on, we're holding down. He understood, too late by years, that the resistance of those families had never been about their homes at all, or not only, that they had been, those old back hollow families, doing a thing, a real thing, by living where they lived, that their presence on that specific ground, the smoke of their fires, and the tread of their feet, and the plain daily fact of a human family being there, had been keeping something in those hollows the way a stone keeps a thing in a well, and that they had known it, and had stayed on purpose, generation after generation. The young ones taught that somebody had to stay, that the hollow was not to be left, without ever being told, maybe exactly what it was they were staying for. Only that it was theirs to do, and that the doing of it was staying, and that the government, in its wisdom guided by its reports about the backward hollow folk, had come and taken every one of them out, had emptied the last of them, the Ledbetters, the Cold Irons, the Buchanans, the very families whose staying had been the point, and had burned their houses so they could never come back and take up the post again, and had left those hollows empty for the first time in the memory of the land, unheld, with whatever the holding had been holding no longer held. And there was nothing to be done about it. That was the part that finished him, because you could not undo it. The families were scattered to the four winds, some to the resettlement homesteads, some to the mill towns, some just gone, and they were old and getting older and dying. And even if you could find them, even if you could gather up what was left of the Ledbetters and the Cold Irons and the Buchanans and carry them back up into those hollows, the houses were ash, and the land was park now, federal land, and you couldn't put a family back on it. And anyway, Rathbone thought, would they even go? Would they go back up to a post they'd been dragged off of? Back to a hollow that had been standing empty and unheld for years, back to whatever was up there now that hadn't had a soul standing over it in all that time? He didn't think they would. He didn't think you could ask a man to. He tried, in his way, to raise it. It fit the shape of the whole thing, the from above, the no one to tell. Rathbone, sick with what he'd started to understand, tried to say something to somebody. He went, or wrote, or tried, to the people over him, the park people, the state people, and tried to put it into words that a reasonable man could say to another reasonable man, that there was something wrong with those emptied hollows, that maybe the removals up there had been a mistake beyond the ordinary sad mistake of them, that maybe those particular families had known something and ought to have been heard. And of course there was nowhere for that to go. Of course there wasn't. He was a relocation agent talking about superstition, about hollow folk notions, about a wrongness he couldn't describe in places where nothing had happened. There was no office for it. There was no form for it. The men he tried to tell were kind to him the way he'd once been kind to Virgie Cold Iron, and they thought about him the way he'd once thought about her. Poor Rathbone. The job's gotten to him, and they filed it under nothing and sent him home. The thing had come from above, from everyone and no one, and there was no above to send the alarm back up to, no single hand that had done it and could be made to see. It had been done by the machine, and the machine had no ears. Rathbone left the work not long after. He'd have left it anyway. The removals were winding down, the park was made, the families were out, his job was ending. But he left it the way a man leaves a thing he can't stand to be near, and he never took another government job, and he never, for the rest of his long life, went up into that country again. The park was right there, an hour from where he lived out his years, the Skyline Drive and the overlooks and the tourists in their cars, all of it open and famous and beloved, and Enoch Rathbone never once went up on it. And when people asked him why, a man who'd worked those mountains, he'd say he'd seen enough of them, which was true and was not the reason. I got the most of this from him. At the very end, an old man threw a chain of people in from a little that he left written. The thing he said that I can't get loose from, he said quiet, near the end, when I'd gotten him to talk about the Ledbetters. He said he'd spent his whole life telling himself the worst thing he ever did was help take those people's homes, and that he'd carried that, and that it was a heavy enough thing to carry. And then he said that somewhere along the way he'd come to understand it wasn't the worst thing, that taking their homes was the ordinary evil, the kind the world is full of, sad and human and forgivable, maybe, in time. But that he hadn't only taken their homes, he'd taken their post. He'd pulled the last watchman off a wall they'd stood on for 150 years without ever knowing it was a wall, and burned the guardhouse so they couldn't climb back up, and walked away, and left whatever was on the other side of that wall with nobody watching it, for the first time since anyone could remember. And that he didn't know what was on the other side of the wall, had never known, would never know, and that the not knowing was its own kind of punishment, because a man can make his peace with a thing he understands, and he could not make his peace with this, because there was nothing to understand, only an emptiness where families used to be, and a dread where the emptiness was, and his own hand on all of it. The hollows are still empty. They're in the park now, deep in it, off the trails, 3 hollows up under those mountains where the game is thick and the people don't go, where a stone chimney or two still stands in the brush from the houses that got burned, where, if the old families were right and Rathbone came to believe they were, something has been sitting unheld for close on 90 years now, with nobody staying, because the last people whose job it was to stay were carried down the mountain behind a wagon and never allowed to come back. Delphia Ledbetter said it as plain as anybody ever said anything. Now there's nobody holding it, and there still isn't. They took the families out and made the park, and it's a beautiful park, and people love it. There are a few hollows in it that nobody goes up, and the old ones would tell you why if there were any old ones left to ask. Somebody used to have to stay up there. Nobody stays up there now. Some things you can't put back once you've moved everybody out. The detector kept flagging a person at Station 11, and Dana Frisbee's first thought was that Station 11's clock was broken. That was the boring explanation, so she went after it first, the way you do. 15 years of images from that one camera location, hundreds of thousands of frames, and the software had chewed through all of it overnight and kicked out a folder of hits. And when she opened the folder, there was a person in nearly all of them. The same person, standing in more or less the same place, and her first assumption was not that it meant anything. Her first assumption was a duplication error, a time-stamped glitch, the kind of thing that can make one image look like 1,000. She spent the better part of a morning proving that wasn't it. When she couldn't, she went to the next boring explanation. And then the one after that, and it was somewhere down that list, days later, that she stopped thinking of it as a problem with the data and started thinking of it as something the data was telling her, which was a much worse place to be. I should explain what she actually did for a living, because the whole thing turns on it, and because the ordinariness of the work is a big part of why nobody had ever seen this before her. Dana Frisbee was a wildlife biologist, and the study she'd taken over was a long-term camera survey up in the high country of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, the big remote forest that covers the tops of the Alleghenies in the eastern part of the state. If you've never been up there, it doesn't look like the rest of Appalachia. It's high, colder, wetter. Dark red spruce forests and open bogs and fog that sits on the ridges for days, the kind of country that even in the daytime feels like the light is coming from somewhere far off. Cheat Mountain, the Cranberry Country, that high spruce plateau. It's black bear country, some of the best in the East, and it's some of the emptiest ground left in that part of the world, and that's why the study was there. It was a bear and wildlife monitoring project, running cameras across the high forest to track what moved through it, and it had been running a long time. 15 years by the time Dana had the whole of it in her hands. Camera traps, they're called, or trail cameras, and if you hunt, you know them, and if you don't, I'll tell you. They're small, weatherproof cameras you strap to a tree, and they've got a motion and heat sensor, so when something warm moves in front of them, they fire, automatically, day or night. At night, they use an infrared flash you can barely see, so the animals don't spook. Nobody's there. That's the point of them. You set a camera at a station, a fixed spot, and you leave it for weeks or months, and it sits there in the dark and the fog firing off pictures of whatever passes, bear and deer and bobcat and coyote. And every so often a field crew hikes in and swaps the memory card and the batteries and hikes back out, and that's the whole of it. The camera stamps each picture with the date and the time and the temperature, and the station has its coordinates logged, so every image is pinned to a place and a moment. And over 15 years, across a few dozen stations, a study like that piles up an ocean of pictures, hundreds of thousands, more. And here's the part that matters, right? The ordinary part. You can't look at all of them. No one can. It's the great problem of that kind of work, the mountain of images. And for years, the way you dealt with it was people, techs and volunteers, sitting at screens tagging what was in each frame, bare, deer, empty, and it took forever, and it was never really finished. Lately, they'd started using software, machine detectors that go through the images and sort them, animal, empty, vehicle, person. And this is the thing, the person pictures get thrown out, always have. A trail camera fires at anything warm that moves, so it fires at hikers, at hunters, at the field crew coming to service it, and all of those are junk as far as a wildlife study goes. False triggers, garbage frames. So for 15 years, every time that camera at Station 11 caught a person, whoever was tagging that batch had looked at it for half a second, thought hiker, or thought that's just the crew, and binned it. Human, exclude. Next. And moved on. Nobody had ever lined those excluded frames up next to each other. Because why would you? They're the trash you throw away to get to the data. It took somebody deciding to do a full retrospective, to run the whole 15-year archive back through a detector all at once and actually look at what got pulled out before anyone saw that the trash at Station 11 was the same person, over and over, for 15 years, that somebody was Dana, and the reason was boring too. The study was being migrated, all the old data pulled together, cleaned up, standardized, put in one place, partly to keep it usable, and partly because she was writing it up. She ran a good detector across the whole archive to resort everything by the new standard. And it was in reviewing what the detector kicked out, the person folder for each station, quality control work, tedious, that she hit Station 11 and found the folder full of one man. She didn't panic. I want to be clear about the way she came at this, because it's the coldest part of the whole account, and it's the part that makes it land. Dana was a quantitative person. She thought in data. And what she saw, at first, was not a ghost and not a mystery. It was an anomaly in a data set, an artifact, a thing that was almost certainly a boring error dressed up to look interesting. And her whole training told her to find the boring error. So she went to work on it like it was a bug report. The timestamp glitch was first, like I said. If the clock was broken, if the camera had somehow stamped the same picture with 1,000 different dates, that would explain 1,000 identical frames of one man. She checked. It wasn't that. The frames weren't identical. They were the same man in the same place, but they were genuinely different pictures. The vegetation was different. Green in some, snow in some, the bare spruce of winter in others. The light was different. The temperature stamps were different and matched the seasons. The man's posture varied a little frame to frame the way a real person shifts. These were real, separate exposures taken across real, separate days. Not a duplication. Then a stuck or looping camera, a sensor firing on the same burned-in image. No, same reasons. Real separate frames. Then a hoax, somebody messing with the cameras. This is a real thing. People find trail cameras and clown for them, and her first serious theory was that some local, some hunter, who knew where the station was, came out and stood in front of it for a joke. But that fell apart fast when she looked at the spread. This wasn't clustered. It wasn't one afternoon of somebody goofing off. The frames were spread across the entire 15 years and more than that. Once she started really reading the dates, they weren't even randomly spread. They fell in a pattern. And no hoaxer keeps a bit going for 15 years, alone, in the fog, on a schedule, at a remote camera in the cranberry backcountry that changed location slightly over the years and that most people didn't know was there. Because the cameras had changed. That was another thing she checked and another thing that made it worse. Over 15 years, a station isn't one camera. Cameras die, get replaced, get upgraded, the model changes, the exact tree changes, the framing shifts a few feet. Station 11 had been 4 or 5 different physical cameras over its life, mounted a little differently each time, different angles, different heights. And the man appeared at that spot regardless, not in front of one camera, at that place, through every generation of equipment, framed differently each time, because the cameras were different, but always there, always in the same patch of ground, as if he were attached to the location and not to any camera. A hoaxer plays to a camera he can see. This man wasn't playing to the camera. He was just there, at the spot, and the cameras happened to catch him from wherever they happened to be. And then she did the periodicity, and that's when she stopped calling it an artifact. She pulled every date the man appeared and laid them out on a timeline. The analyst's reflex, look at the intervals. And the intervals weren't random, and they weren't a fixed number of days either. They were a year. He appeared once a year, and not just once a year, on the same date every year. The same calendar date, give or take a day, every single year of the 15-year archive, right down the line, 15 appearances, one a year, on that date, at that spot, at close to the same time of the early evening. She said when the pattern resolved on the screen in front of her, she felt the hair go up on her arms before she'd consciously understood why, the body getting there ahead of the mind. Because a thing that regular is not weather, and it is not an animal, and it is not noise. A signal that clean, in that much data, means something is generating it. Something is coming to that place on that date on purpose, every year, and had been for 15 years. And no living thing behaves with that kind of precision, except on a calendar it's keeping. She had the field assistant look then, Tamara Angel, who'd been on the project a couple of years and knew the stations and the country. Dana didn't tell her what she thought, just put the folder in front of her, the man at Station 11 across the years, and asked her what she saw. And Tamara went through them, and she was quiet. And then she said the thing that turned it from a pattern into a person. She said, "I think I know who that is." She said it looked like the man off the flyers, the missing man. And Dana said what missing man, because she was newer to the country than Tamara, and Tamara told her that years back, before either of them, a man had gone missing up in that high country, and there had been flyers all over Elkins and Marlinton and the trailheads for a long time. A hunter, gone up on the mountain and never came back, and that the face in the Station 11 pictures looked like him, and his name, Tamara thought, was Greer. Hobart Greer. So Dana went and found the case, because there's always paper. A man doesn't vanish off a mountain without leaving a file. And she put the file next to the pictures, and it lined up in a way that took the floor out from under her, cold as she was about it. Hobart Greer had been a local man, a hunter, from down in the valley country below the high forest, and he had disappeared going up onto that mountain into that exact high spruce country on a hunting trip he took every single year. That was the first thing. It wasn't a random spot. Greer had a habit, a settled yearly habit of going up to a particular place on the mountain right before the season opened, an old camp, an old spot his family had used, and he went every year at the same time, the same few days, alone, the way some men do, a ritual as much as a hunt. And the spot he went to, when Dana ran the coordinates in the case file against her station map, was Station 11, or right on top of it. The camera had been placed, years after Greer vanished, in the exact saddle of ground that Hobart Greer had gone up to every year of his life. And the date he went missing, the date he was last seen heading up the mountain, his truck found at the trailhead below and never moved again, was the date. The date in the pictures, the date the man appeared at Station 11 every year, that was where the before and after came in. And it's the part I've never been able to get out of my head since Dana walked me through it. The camera study started after Greer disappeared, but only by a few years. And the early part of the archive overlapped with the tail end of when people still remembered him and looked for him. So in the earliest frames, the first year or two of the study, there was an argument to be made, a terrible thin argument that it was just Greer, a living man, up at his spot on his date, because the study had started close enough to his disappearance that maybe the timeline was fuzzier than the file said. Maybe he'd come back. Maybe. Dana chased that. She wanted it to be that. And it did not survive contact with the file. Because the file was clear, the search had been thorough. The man had been gone for years before the first camera ever went up at Station 11, declared dead in absence long before the archive began. There was no year in the 15 where a living Hobart Greer could have stood at that spot. Every one of the 15 appearances came after the man was gone, and the man in the pictures did not change across those 15 years. Same coat, a canvas hunting coat, same cap, same build, same way of standing, year after year, no older in the last frame than the first, while everything around him, the trees, the cameras, the study, the country, aged 15 years, and Dana herself went gray a little at the temples working the data. He didn't age. He came up to the spot on his date every year, in the same clothes, and stood, and the camera caught him. And then the next year he did it again. She went and found Rufus Radford after that, because she needed somebody who'd been there for the human part of it. And Rufus was the man. Rufus Radford was a retired game warden, an old conservation officer who'd worked that district back when Greer went missing and who'd been in on the search. He was old by the time Dana got to him, but sharp, and he remembered the Greer case the way men remember the ones that don't close. He told her about the search, and it was an ordinary sad search, days of it, dog teams and volunteers and the state police working grids across the high country, and they found the truck, and they found nothing else. No body, no camp disturbed, no sign. The man just gone off the top of the mountain into the fog and never turned up. Not that year, not ever. Rufus talked about the country up there, how it swallowed things, how a man could be 20 feet off a trail in that spruce and rhododendron and never be found, and how they'd always figured that was what happened, that Greer had gotten turned around or hurt and lay down somewhere the searchers walked right past, and the mountain kept him. An ordinary tragedy, the kind the high country produces every few years. And then Dana, careful, showed Rufus the pictures, and she watched an old warden who'd seen everything look at 15 years of a dead man standing at the spot he vanished from, and she said Rufus went very still and looked a long time, and then he said something she wrote down. He said, "We always wondered if he was still up there." He said it quiet, and Dana thought he meant the body, that they'd always wondered if the bones were still up on that mountain somewhere unfound. And she started to say something about that, and Rufus shook his head, just a little, and didn't explain what he'd meant, and she let it go. And she said she was never sure after that whether the old man had meant the body or had meant something else, and that she hadn't wanted to ask. There was a thing Rufus told her, though, that fit into the coldest part of it, and it's the part about how nobody had ever looked. He said the study people had come across the man in the pictures before, years before Dana. That one of the earlier techs, or maybe the researcher who'd run it before her, she was never fully clear, had noticed a while back that there was a recurring person at one of the high stations, and had flagged it, and had asked about it, and had been told, essentially, to drop it. Not by anybody sinister, by the ordinary machinery of the thing. It was a false trigger. It was a person, and persons are excluded, and the study was about bears. And there was no line item, and no funding, and no reason to spend time on a hiker who kept turning up at a camera, and somebody up the chain, a supervisor, a principal investigator, somebody whose name Rufus didn't have and Dana could never pin down, had said, reasonably, flag it as human, exclude it, and move on. We're not a missing persons operation. We're a wildlife survey. And that had been that. It had been seen and set aside, not out of any malice, just out of the plain fact that it wasn't what anybody was being paid to look at. And so it had gone back into the trash folder for another few years until Dana ran the whole thing at once and couldn't unsee it. And when Dana tried to take it further, tried to make it official, to get somebody to look at it as what it was, the same door closed on her, softly, the way those doors do. She brought it up the chain. She had the pattern, the periodicity, the file, the identification, the whole thing laid out cold and quantitative, and the answers she got back were all versions of the same thing, which was that this was not the study's business, and there was nothing to be done with it. It was excluded data. It was officially a series of false triggers, human, and the fact that the human appeared to be a man who'd been dead for 15 years was not a finding a wildlife study could make or would want to make or had any mechanism to act on. She was told, kindly, more than once, by people who were not being cruel, to flag it and let it go, to finish her write-up, to not turn a bear survey into a thing that would get the project looked at sideways. There was no one, in the end, who would take it, no office it belonged to, no authority whose job it was, because the man was dead and the case was closed and the pictures were, on paper, garbage frames. Blame nobody, own nothing, exclude and move on. But Dana, cold as she was, or maybe because she was cold, couldn't quite move on. Because she had the pattern, and a pattern lets you do one thing that a story doesn't. It lets you predict. She knew the date. She knew he came on the date. And Station 11 was still live, still part of the running study, a current camera in the current network, collecting right now, the same as it had for 15 years. So she did the thing that, I think, when she told it, was the thing that finally broke her scientific distance, though she'd never have put it that way. She waited for the date, the anniversary, the day Hobart Greer went up the mountain and didn't come down, and she pulled the current card from Station 11 herself, or had it pulled, and she went through it. He was there, on the date. That year, the current year, the 16th year, with a camera that had been up only a season, framed differently than any of the 15 before it, because it was a new camera on a new tree. Hobart Greer stood in the saddle at Station 11 in his canvas coat and his cap, no older, in the early evening. On the day he vanished, and the camera caught him the way it had caught him every year, and the way, Dana understood standing there with the card reader in her hand, it would catch him next year, and the year after that, on the date, forever, a dead man keeping an appointment with a mountain, logged and stamped and pinned to a coordinate, generating a clean annual signal in a data set that had no room for him and no name for what he was. She flagged them. That's how it ended, on the official side. She did what she'd been told and what the study required and what was, on the paper, correct. She went into the database and she tagged all 16 years of him, human, false trigger, excluded, and that is his status now. That is what Hobart Greer is in the record of that study. An excluded human detection recurring annually at Station 11, and it is the truest and the most terrible thing in the whole archive. A missing man reduced to a data quality note, appearing on schedule, filtered out so the bears can be counted. She kept her own copy, though. All of it, the 16 frames, off the official system, on a drive of her own. And Tamara told me, because I did eventually get to Tamara too, that Dana never could leave it alone after that. That around that date every year, Dana would get quiet and would find a reason to pull the Station 11 card early and go through it herself, before anybody else, and that she never said what she was looking for and never said what she found, but that she did it every year, and that the folder on her private drive had more than 16 frames in it now. The study's still running, last I knew. There are bears on that mountain and cameras counting them, and a man in a canvas coat who comes up to a saddle on the high spruce plateau one evening a year, on the day he went missing, and stands there and is photographed by machines that fire at anything warm and is then removed from the data as noise. Rufus Radford said they always wondered if he was still up there. Dana Frisbee has 15 years of automatic photographs and counting that say he is, and no way in the world to say what that means. And a column in a database that says, correctly, that none of it counts. He comes on the same day every year, up to the same spot, and the cameras catch him. And then somebody marks him excluded, and the study goes on. That's the whole of it. A missing man who keeps his date, and a note in a file that says he isn't there. Some things you can measure and still not be allowed to have found. There were better than 20 years of logbooks in a wooden ammunition box under the bunk in the cab, and Arliss Stanley read them the way you read anything when you're alone on top of a mountain with nothing but weather for company. Slow. Out of order. A page here, a page there, by lamplight after the sun went down and there was nothing left to watch. It was maybe a month into his season, up on the tower in the Iron Mountains, with the whole of southwest Virginia laid out gray and folded below him, that he turned to the last page one of them had written. It was a woman's book, a lookout named Dosha Wampler, and he read the last thing she ever logged up there. And then, later that same night, further down in the box, in a different book, in a different hand, a man's this time, he read the exact same words again, word for word. Two people, years apart who'd never met, ending their season the same way, in the same sentences, as if they'd both copied it off something he couldn't see. I should tell you what the job was, because hardly anybody does it anymore, and it was a strange kind of work even when it was common, and the strangeness of it is part of the thing. Arliss Stanley was a fire lookout. In the middle part of the last century, before airplanes and satellites did it, the way you watched for forest fires was you put a man on top of a mountain and left him there. All across these mountains and all across the West, they built fire towers, steel towers, 40, 60, 80 feet tall, up on the highest peaks, with a little glass cab on top, maybe 14 feet square, and a man lived up in that cab through the fire season and watched. That was the whole job. You watched. Every daylight hour, in every direction. You watched the forest for the first thread of smoke. And when you saw one, you went to the instrument in the middle of the cab, a thing called an Osborne firefinder, which was a metal ring with sights on it set over a circular map. And you lined the sights up on the smoke and read off the bearing, the exact compass direction, and you called it in on the radio. And another tower, miles away, would sight the same smoke and read their bearing, and where the two lines crossed, that was the fire, and they'd send men to it. That was how it worked. It worked well. It saved a lot of country. And it meant that at any given time there were men and women scattered across the tops of the mountains, each one alone in a glass box in the sky, watching. The tower Arliss took was up in the Iron Mountains, in the Jefferson National Forest, in the high corner of southwest Virginia where Mount Rogers and White Top stand up over everything, the highest country in the state, up above Marion and Abingdon, and the little town of Troutdale, over toward the Grayson Highlands where the balds run open and the ponies graze and the Appalachian Trail comes through. It's high country, and it's cold, and it fogs in for days, red spruce and open grass balds and a rock, and it feels a long way from anywhere even now, and it felt further then. The tower sat on a knob back off the main ridge, a good ways from any road, built by the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the 30s, like most of them were, and it had been manned every fire season since, spring and fall, for close to 40 years by the time Arliss climbed up into it. He took the job because he wanted the quiet. That's what he told me, and I believed him. He was a quiet man to start with, had done a hitch in the service and had come home not fitting easily back into things, and the idea of a season alone on a mountain being paid to sit and watch and not talk to a soul sounded to him less like a hardship than like a cure. And for the first stretch of it, it was. He'd tell you the first weeks up, there were the best weeks he'd had in years. You get supplied every so often. Somebody packs food and fuel up to you and you have a radio to call in on. And otherwise, you're alone with the weather and the light and the enormous quiet of being higher than everything. And for a man who wanted exactly that, it was close to peace. He kept the watch through the days, and he kept his log the way you're supposed to, weather and visibility and any smoke and any visitors. And at night he read, because there wasn't anything else, and that's how he came to the box of old logbooks under the bunk. He didn't think anything of them at first. Every tower had them, the accumulated logs of everybody who'd ever kept it, and reading back through them was a natural thing to do, a way to have a little company, to know who'd sat in that same chair before you and watched the same country. And the old logs were mostly dull, the way his own was dull. Weather and visibility and the occasional fire, day after day, the plain record of the job. He'd read a season here and a season there, get a feel for the person from how they wrote, and move on to the next. It was the last entries that caught him, and it caught him slow, the way a wrong thing catches you when you're not looking for it. Because each logbook was one season, he'd noticed that without noticing it. A logbook would start in the early spring, or the fall, and run through to the end of the season, and then it would stop, and the next book in the box would be a different hand entirely, a new person, starting fresh the next season. And at first, he took that for the ordinary turnover of a hard job, people doing a season and moving on. But then he read Dosia Wampler's last page, the woman's, and it stayed with him because it was odd. And then that same night, he found the identical words in the man's book, and the two of them together turned the oddness into something with a shape. I'll tell you what the last entry said, because it's the center of the whole thing, and because Arliss had it by heart by the end, and said it to me more than once, the same way every time. Each of them, on their last day, wrote this. They wrote, "Last day of the season, nothing to report. The whole season through. It isn't the fires, and it isn't being alone up here. I won't be back." That was it, word for word in book after book, in hand after hand. Nothing to report the whole season, which by itself was a strange thing to write, because a season is long and things happen, and yet they all wrote nothing to report. And then that flat denial, it isn't the fires, and it isn't being alone, as if they were answering a question, heading off the obvious thing anybody would think, which is that a lookout quits because the solitude breaks them. No, they each wrote, it isn't that. And then, I won't be back. And none of them ever were. Once he'd seen it in 2 books, he went through the whole box, and it was in all of them. Every single one. He laid them out on the bunk by the lamp and went season by season backward, and every last page ended the same way. Those same 3 sentences, in a different hand each time, going back to the very bottom of the box, going back near 40 years. The very oldest one, the first, was a man named Zeb Fugate, who'd have been the first lookout when the CCC finished the tower in the 30s, and even Zeb Fugate, in the oldest, most faded book, had ended his one season with those exact words. Nothing to report the whole season. It isn't the fires, and it isn't being alone. I won't be back. And then the next season, a woman named Nanny Osborne had come and done her one season and written the same. And then a man named Verlin Shook, one season the same. Dosia Wampler, one season the same. On and on, 40 years of them, one to a season, never a repeat, never a soul who came back for a second year, and every one of them signing off with the identical sentence as if it were required, as if it were printed at the bottom of the last page and they were just tracing over it. He sat with that a long time, up in the glass box in the dark, and he tried, the way you do, to find the ordinary reason. Maybe it was a tradition, he thought. Maybe the lookouts up there had passed down a kind of ritual, a thing you wrote on your last day, a joke almost, a superstition, and each new one had read the old logs like he was reading them now and copied the ending as a bit of custom. That was the best explanation, and he held on to it as long as he could. But it fell apart when he really looked, because for it to be a passed-down tradition, each lookout would have had to read the old books and decide to copy the line, and some of them plainly hadn't been readers, you could tell from their logs. Barely literate men who wrote 3 words a day about the weather and nothing else. Men who you couldn't imagine sitting up nights going through 20 years of other people's logbooks the way Arliss was. And even if they had, why would every one of them, without exception, over 40 years, choose to copy that particular line and nothing else, and never break the pattern, never one lookout who signed off different, never one who came back for a second season and ruined the count? A tradition has holes in it. People forget, people vary, somebody always does it different. This had no holes. It was clean the whole way down. And clean like that isn't people choosing. Clean like that is something happening to them. And that was the thought he couldn't get back out of once it was in, that it wasn't the people, that whatever wrote that entry, whatever did one season and quit and never came back, it wasn't Zeb Fugate or Dosia Wampler or Verlin Shook, it was the tower, the post, that the mountain took whoever you put up there, whoever they were, however different they came, and used them up in exactly one season and put the same words in their mouth at the end, and sent them down never to return, and then took the next one. And Arliss Stanley, sitting up there in his first season with the box of logbooks open on the bunk, understood, cold, that he was the newest name in the count, that there was a blank last page waiting in the book he was writing, and that if the last 40 years meant anything, he already knew what he was going to write on it, and that he had not decided to write it and would not be able to help it. The light was the thing his season had in it that the logs had prepared him for without his knowing. It's the only concrete thing in the whole account, and it explains nothing. Somewhere in that same stretch, going through the old logs, Arliss had started noticing that the daily entries, the dull ones, weren't quite as dull as he'd thought, that there was a thing in them that recurred if you knew to look. Lookouts logged smoke. That was the job. And every lookout, sooner or later in their season, started logging a smoke or a light at night at a bearing that they couldn't account for. It's in the entries, plain, the way you'd log anything. A light, southwest, such and such degrees, and then the next night, the same, and the next. And it wasn't reported as a fire because you don't get smoke at night, you get the glow of flame, and this wasn't reported as flame either. It was logged careful, in that flat lookout's way, as a light, at a bearing, that recurred and that no fire was ever found at, because they would have checked. A recurring light in the forest, a lookout calls that in, and men go look, and if there'd ever been a fire there, it would have burned and been fought and been in the record. There never was. The bearing pointed off into the deepest part of the forest below the knob. A hollow with no road into it, and no cabin in it, and no reason on earth for a light, and night after night, season after season, lookout after lookout. There was a light there, at the same bearing, near enough the same every time, and not one of them ever found a source for it, and not one of them ever explained it in the log. They just kept logging it, the same bearing, until their season ended and they wrote the line and went down the mountain and never came back. Arliss saw it himself, of course. He must have known he would. It came, I think he said, sometime in the second month, a night when the fog lifted and the forest went black and huge below him, and there it was, a light, down in the deep hollow at the southwest bearing, small and steady, where he knew for a fact there was nothing, no road, no house, no reason. And he did what they all did. He went to the firefinder and he sighted it and he read the bearing and he wrote it in his log, a light southwest and the degrees, and he sat and watched it. And it didn't flicker like fire and it didn't move like a lantern being carried. It just sat there, steady, in the middle of country where there was nothing to make a light, and after a while it wasn't there anymore. And he couldn't have told you when it had gone, only that at some point he realized he was watching a dark hollow, and then it was there the next night, and the next. And Stanley began to do the thing that was the actual heart of what the tower did to people, the thing the last entry was really about. He began to watch for it. His job was to watch the whole forest, all the way around, for smoke, in the daylight. But his nights, which had been for reading and sleeping, started to be for watching the southwest bearing, for the light, and he found he couldn't not. He'd tell himself he'd go to sleep, and he'd end up at the glass, looking at that one dark spot, waiting for the light to come up. And when it came, he'd watch it the whole time it burned, and when it went, he'd feel the night was over, even if it was hours to dawn. It got into him. The watching got into him, the way the logs had warned him without warning him, and he understood, doing it, why it isn't the being alone. Because it wasn't the solitude that was wearing him down. A man can bear solitude. It was that the solitude had a thing in it, one small steady light in the dark that shouldn't be there and that you could not stop watching once you knew it came, and that watching it, night after night, took something out of you that a season's worth of it used all the way up. There was nobody to take it to, either, and Arliss came to understand that in his own time. Not the Forest Service, who ran the towers and kept the records and would have told you accurately that it was a hard post to keep staffed, remote, and lonesome, that they went through lookouts up there, and that was that. Which was true, as far as it went, and explained nothing. There was no line in any record about a light, or about 40 years of identical last pages. There was no office you could take that to, and no person whose business it was. The wrongness of it didn't live in the records. It lived in a box of logbooks under a bunk that nobody but the next lookout would ever read. His season ran to its end the way seasons do, the fire danger dropping off as the fall came on and the woods went wet. And there came a last day, and Arliss Stanley sat down in the cab with his logbook to close it out. And he told me that he sat there a long time with the pen, because he knew, he'd known for months, what the last 40 years said he was going to write. And he'd told himself the whole way through his season that he wouldn't, that he'd break it, that he'd write something else, anything else, or nothing, and be the one lookout in the history of that tower who ended his season different. And he sat there on his last day, and he found that he could not do it. Not because anything stopped him, no hand, nothing dramatic. It was that when he tried to write down what his season had actually been, the true account of it, the only true account, the honest words for it, the words that came were the words, that there was nothing to report, because nothing had happened that you could report. No fire, no incident, no event, just a light in a place where there was no light, and a man watching it night after night until it used him up. That it wasn't the fires, because it never had been the fires. And that it wasn't being alone, because being alone he could have borne. And that he would not be back, because he knew, the way all of them must have known, that he could not do another season of it and live right afterward. The line wasn't a curse somebody had laid on the book. It was just the only true thing there was to write. And every honest person who'd ever kept that watch had come to the same last day and found the same to be the only true thing, and written it, and gone down the mountain and stayed gone. So he wrote it. Last day of the season, nothing to report, the whole season through. It isn't the fires, and it isn't being alone up here. I won't be back. And he put the book in the box with all the others. And he climbed down off the tower, and he went home, and he never went back up. He was, as it turned out, near enough the last. The tower was manned only a season or two more after Arliss, and then the Forest Service shut it down, the way they shut nearly all of them down in those years. Once the airplanes could do the watching cheaper. They decommissioned it, took the radio out, stopped sending lookouts, let it stand. So the post stopped using people up, in the end, not because anybody broke it, or solved it, or even looked at it, but because the bureaucracy that had kept it going quietly stopped keeping it going, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this, budget and airplanes and the march of things. And the last lookout wrote the last entry and came down, and the tower went empty for good, which is a strange way for a thing like that to end, if it ended. Just closed from above, for other reasons, by people who never knew there was anything there to close. The tower's still up there, decommissioned but standing on the knob in the Iron Mountains, and people hike up to it now, up from the Grayson Highlands country, and climb the steps for the view, which is one of the great views in Virginia, all that high country rolling off in every direction. And I don't know what happened to the box of logbooks, whether it's still under the bunk or whether somebody carted it off years ago, 40 years of one-season lookouts and their identical last day, sitting in an ammunition box in an empty glass room on top of a mountain. Arliss Stanley told me the most of this himself, an old man by then, and he told it plain, and he didn't try to make it more than it was. And the one thing he said at the end that I keep is that he'd been up on a lot of high places since in his life, and he'd never once minded the height or the being alone, that those had never been the thing. He said the thing was the watching. He said he'd learned up on that tower that there are places where, if you watch long enough, something watches back, or seems to, and that once you've had a season of that, you don't ever fully stop, that some part of him was still up there on the knob in the dark, all these years later, at the glass, waiting for the light to come up at the southwest bearing where there was never anything to make a light, and that he'd done his one season, and it had been enough, and he'd never been back, and he wasn't going back. And that if I ever went up there, and he said this kindly, the way Delphia might have and the old warden did, I ought not to stay up there past dark. 40 years of lookouts, one to a season, and every one of them wrote the same last thing and went down the mountain and never came back up. Then they shut the tower for other reasons, and it didn't matter anymore. It's still up there, the empty glass room and the view, and if there's a box of logbooks left in it, the last page of every book says the same. Some posts don't so much end as get left standing. It was the dog that found Amos Woody in the end, not the men. He was 11 feet off the main trail, down in a laurel thicket so tight you couldn't see a foot into it from the path, and he had been there 9 days. Boone Hicks had walked that trail himself, he figured, better than a dozen times over those 9 days. Calling? They all had. 40-some searchers up and down that trail day and night for 9 days, and Amos Woody was 11 feet off it in the laurel the whole time, and not one of them ever heard him, and not one of them ever saw him. And when the dog finally put them on him and they cut their way in, Boone stood over what was left and could not understand it. It was a long time before he understood what it had made him part of. And by the time he did, he almost wished he'd stayed not understanding. Boone Hicks spent the better part of 30 years finding people who were lost in the mountains, and he was as good at it as anybody in that part of the country. And I want to lay out what the work actually is before I tell you the rest, because the whole thing turns on how the work is supposed to go and on the one cove where it never went that way. He did search and rescue. In the mountains of western North Carolina, up in the far corner where the Monongahela National Forest runs into the Snowbird Mountains, in Graham County above Robbinsville, over toward the Joyce-Kilmer and the Slick Rock Wilderness, some of the roughest and least traveled country in the whole southern Appalachians. People get lost up there. Hikers, hunters, folks who wander off from a campsite to find the creek and turn around and can't find their way back. And every year, some number of them don't come out on their own, and somebody has to go in after them. And for 30 years, Boone was one of the people who went in. He wasn't with any one agency exactly. He was the kind of man they called a tracker, a woodsman, somebody who could read the ground and think like a lost person. And when a search got called, he'd get the phone call and he'd go. And searching for a lost person is more of a science than people think. It isn't just a bunch of men walking around in the woods hollering, though there's some of that. There's a whole body of knowledge about how lost people behave, where they go, and it holds up. It's been studied for decades because lost people, it turns out, are not random. They do the same things. They tend to go downhill because downhill is easier and because water is down and people follow water. They get funneled by the terrain, down the drainages, into the hollows. They're usually found closer to where they went missing than you'd guess, most of them within a certain distance of the last place they were seen, because a person on foot in rough country doesn't actually cover as much ground as they think they do, especially once they're scared and tired and it's getting dark. So when Boone got called to a search, he didn't start by looking everywhere. He started by figuring the point last seen, and then he thought about the terrain and the behavior, and he searched the likely places first, the drainages, the downhill, the spots the country would funnel a person into. And most of the time, it worked. Most of the time you found them alive if you were quick and lucky, and it was the best feeling there is. And if you weren't quick enough, you found them anyway, and at least the family knew, and that mattered too. The way you actually cover the ground is layered. First, you do what they call a hasty search, fast. A few good people moving quick through the highest probability spots, the trails and the drainages, calling out and stopping to listen, because a lost person who can still answer will answer. Then, if that doesn't turn them up, you bring in more people and you grid it, lines of searchers spaced out an arm's length or a few arm's lengths apart, walking slow, sweeping an area foot by foot so nothing gets missed. And you use dogs, air-scent dogs that catch a person's scent on the wind, and trailing dogs that follow where they went. And through all of it, the calling and the listening, over and over, you shout the person's name and you stop and you hold still and you listen for an answer. And that listening is everything, because a voice will carry where an eye can't see, and a lost person's voice calling back is the thing that ends most searches that end well. Now there's one more piece of it you have to understand, and it's the piece that makes this whole story what it is, and it's a real thing, not something I'm making up for effect. In that country, there is a kind of terrain called a laurel hell. It's rhododendron and mountain laurel, grown up thick, and I mean thick past anything you can picture if you haven't been in it, a tangle of tough, twisted limbs grown so dense and so interlocked that you cannot walk through it. You have to crawl or cut, and you can be one arm's length from open ground and not be able to see out, and not be able to be seen. Laurel Hell, the old people named it, and they named it right. And a lost person, funneled downhill by the terrain, tired and cold and not thinking straight, will crawl into a laurel hell to get out of the wind, or because they've fallen into it and can't get back out. And once they're in there, they are, for all practical purposes, invisible. A searcher can walk the edge of a laurel hell and never know there's a human being 10 feet inside it. This is a known thing in search and rescue. It's one of the hardest problems there is. People have been found dead in Laurel a stone's throw from trails that were walked 100 times. That part is just true. It's terrible enough on its own. And it is not the strange part of what happened in that cove. It's the floor the strange part stands on. Because there was one cove. I'm not going to be able to give you its right name. Boone himself got funny about naming it after a while, and it's one cove among 1,000 up in that snowbird country. A deep, steep cove with a creek running down the bottom of it through the boulders and the laurel, walls rising up close on both sides, thick timber, the kind of place there's 100 of up there and no reason to think anything of. It had a bad name, some, before Boone's time, the way places do. Old talk. People had gone missing up in that cove before anybody was keeping the kind of records Boone would come to keep. Back in the old days, hunters and such, and there was a low reputation to it, that it was a bad cove to get turned around in, that it didn't give people back. But every rough cove up there has some version of that talk, and Boone, a practical man, paid it no mind for years. It was just a cove. He searched it more than once early in his career, ordinary searches, and they went the ordinary way, more or less, and he thought nothing of it. The first time he thought something of it was a man named Elijah Combs. Elijah Combs was a hunter, gone missing up in that cove in the fall, and they'd searched hard for him. Days. The hasty search, and then the grids and the dogs, and they'd found him, which was the good part, except that when they found him, Boone couldn't square where he was. Elijah Combs was down low in the cove near the creek, which fit the behavior, downhill and toward water. That was right. But he was close. He was inside an area that had already been searched, gridded, walked, and not just walked once. He was maybe 40 or 50 feet from a line that Boone knew for a fact had been swept, because Boone had helped sweep it, and Elijah Combs had been dead a while by the time they found him, long enough that he'd have been there, right there, when the line went through. Well, they had walked past him, 40, 50 feet, in country that wasn't even that thick right there, and they'd called his name going through the way you do, and they'd stopped and listened, and they'd gone on, and he'd been right there. And Boone stood over Elijah Combs the way he'd later stand over Amos Woody and thought, we missed him. We were right on top of him, and we missed him. And it bothered him. It bothered him a lot, because Boone did not miss people by 40 feet. That wasn't the kind of tracker he was, and he chewed on it for a good while. But in the end, he did what you do. He chalked it up. Bad luck. The thick ground. A man can be missed. It happens. He filed it away and he didn't forget it, but he didn't let it mean anything yet. It was Zona Franklin, some years on, that turned it from a bad memory into a pattern. Zona Franklin was a woman who'd been out with a group and gotten separated up in that same cove, and again they searched it hard. And again, when they found her, she was close. Closer, even. She was down in the bottom of the cove near the creek, in the laurel this time, and she was inside searched ground, and there was a trail not far from her that had been walked and walked and walked, and she had been alive for some of it. That was the thing about Zona Franklin that Boone could never shake, and it's the first time the real horror of it came up on him. There were signs, when they found her, that she'd been alive for days in there. Days after she went missing, days during which the search was going on all around her, men and dogs and calling, feet away. And she had been alive in the laurel the whole time, and she had not been found. And worse than that, and Boone was sure of this from the way they found her, from the ground around her. She had been trying. She hadn't just lain down and given up. She'd been moving a little, and she'd been, near as anybody could tell, calling. There was every reason to think Zona Franklin had spent days down in that cove calling for help, while the people who'd come to save her walked the trail 40 feet away calling her name, and that neither of them, not her and not them, had ever heard the other. And Boone stood there, and this time he did not chalk it up, because it was the second time, the exact same thing in the exact same cove, close, alive, calling, unheard. And 2 is not luck. 2 is a pattern. And once he saw the pattern, he could not unsee it, and he went back, in his mind and then in the records, over every search he'd ever done in that cove. And it was there in all of them if you looked. The people who went missing in that cove were never far. They were always close, and they were always missed. Now Boone was, like I said, a practical man, and a pattern like that, to a practical man, means there is a reason, and he set about finding the reason. And this is where it stops being just a sad, hard fact of rough country and starts being the thing it is, because he found the reason, or he found a reason. And the reason was real, and it explained the how of it completely, and it explained the why of it not at all. And the gap between those two is where Boone Hicks lived for the rest of his life. He figured out that you couldn't hear in that cove. He came to it slow, and he came to it partly by accident and partly by testing it once he'd started to suspect. What he noticed, first, was that the cove was loud in a particular way. The creek ran down through the bottom of it over boulders, a lot of water dropping fast through rock, and it made a steady roar the way those creeks do. And Boone knew that creek noise masks a human voice. Everybody in search and rescue knows that. You can't hear a person calling over the sound of moving water. It's a known problem. But it was more than that. Because Boone got to testing it, after Zona Franklin, he'd take somebody up into that cove, and he'd put them down in the bottom near where the missing kept turning up, and he'd walk off to where the trail ran, and he'd have them holler as loud as they could. And he found that you could not hear them. Not just that it was hard, that you could not hear them at all. A grown person screaming as loud as a human being can scream 40 feet away, 50 feet away, and up on that trail, Boone could not hear one thing, nothing, not a whisper of it, just the creek and the wind. And then he'd walk down to them and have them keep hollering, and he'd hear it come up out of nothing as he got close. And there was a line, a place where it went from nothing to something sharp, like stepping through a door. And on the far side of that door, down in the bottom of the cove, a person could scream their lungs out and it would not carry 10 yards. It's a real thing. I want to say that plainly because it matters. There's a name for it, more or less. An acoustic shadow, a dead zone, a place where the sound doesn't carry, and it happens. It's documented. It happened in old battles where men couldn't hear the guns a few miles off while people 50 miles away heard them plain. It comes from the shape of the land and the way sound bends, and it comes from the air, from cold air pooling in a low place and warm air above it, an inversion, which bends sound up and away from the ground so it goes over your head instead of reaching your ear. And that cove had all of it. It had the steep, close walls, and it had the loud creek, and it had the deep, cold bottom where the cold air pooled and sat, and it had the thick laurel that soaks up sound on top of everything else. And all of it together made, in the bottom of that cove, near the creek, a place where sound went to die, where a voice, any voice, no matter how loud, simply did not travel out. It was physics. Boone had a man come up once who knew about such things, and the man walked the cove and did some testing of his own and told Boone, yes, this is a real acoustic dead zone, one of the strongest he'd ever come across. The terrain and the water and the cold air all lined up just wrong, and that it was no wonder at all that you couldn't hear a person calling from down in there. Perfectly explainable. The man was almost cheerful about it, the way people are when they can explain a thing. And that explained everything, and it explained nothing, and here's exactly where the nothing is, and it's the whole of what Boone could never get past. It explained why the missing weren't heard. Fine. The dead zone ate the sound. A person could be 40 feet from a searcher, screaming and not be heard because of the physics. All right, but it did not explain why the missing were always down there. Why every single person who got lost in that cove ended up in the one spot in the whole cove where they couldn't be heard. Boone knew the behavior. He knew lost people go downhill and toward water, and the dead zone was down low near the water. So you could tell yourself that the behavior naturally carried them into the dead zone, that they went down toward the creek like all lost people do, and the down toward the creek happened to be the silent place. And Boone tried to tell himself exactly that for a while, but it was too clean. It was too every time. Because lost people go downhill in general, they don't all end up in the same 40-foot patch of one cove. They scatter some, they end up in this drainage or that one, high or low. And yet, in this cove, every one of them, Elijah Combs and Zona Franklin and the ones before Boone's time and Amos Woody after, ended up in the dead zone. Not near it. In it. As if the cove didn't just happen to have a silent place in it that lost people sometimes wandered into. As if the cove funneled them there. As if the whole shape of the thing, the walls and the water and the laurel, was built to carry a lost and frightened person down into the one place where nothing they did, no sound they made, could ever reach the people looking for them, and then to hold them there, silent, while the search went on and on all around them and never knew. And there was the other part, the part that came up on him with Zona Franklin and never left, which was that they were alive. Not all of them, you couldn't always tell, but Zona Franklin had been alive for days in there. And once Boone understood about the dead zone, he understood what that meant. And it was the worst thing he ever had to carry out of 30 years of carrying hard things. It meant that those people had spent days down in the bottom of that cove, alive, hearing the search. Because that's the thing. The dead zone worked both ways, but not evenly. And Boone worked this out too, that a person down in the silent place could sometimes hear the searchers up above. The sound coming down into the bowl, even when it wouldn't go back up out of it. So that a lost person down in that cove might well have been able to hear the men calling their name, hear the dogs, hear the help right there 40 feet off, and have screamed back with everything they had, and had the scream die in the dead air 6 feet from their own mouth, and heard the searchers move on. Days of that. Hearing rescue come, and hearing it call your name, and screaming back, and having it not hear you, and having it leave, over and over, for days, 40 feet away. That's what Boone Hicks understood he had been part of, without knowing it, in that cove for years, walking the trail, calling their names, listening, and them right there, hearing him, screaming, and him not hearing a thing, and going home at dark and coming back the next day and doing it again while they died 40 feet away, listening to him not hear them. He tried to do something about it, and it went the way all of these go. Boone Hicks, once he understood, tried to get it recognized, tried to get that cove marked, tried to get it into how searches were run, tried to get somebody with any authority to acknowledge that there was a place up in that snowbird country where a lost person could not be heard, and where lost people always ended up, so that the next time somebody went missing up there, the search would start in the dead zone, would go straight to the bottom of that cove and crawl the laurel foot by foot instead of trusting the calling and the listening that did not work there. He took it to the people who ran searches, he took it up the chain, to the agencies, the Forest Service, whoever there was to take it to, and it went nowhere. And it went nowhere in that particular soft, faceless way where nobody tells you no exactly and nobody does anything either. They didn't disbelieve him, quite. The acoustic thing was real. They couldn't argue the physics. But there was no procedure for it, no box to put it in, no line item. No one whose job it was to go mark a cove as a place where the dead turn up because you can't hear them scream. It was a curiosity. It was a sad local peculiarity. It got listened to and nodded at and filed under nothing. And the searches went on being run the way searches are run, from the point last seen, with the calling and the listening, and Boone could never get any of them to understand that in that one cove the listening was worse than useless, that the listening was a cruelty, that every minute spent listening for a voice that could not carry was a minute the person spent dying in the silence hearing you. There was no one to make see it. It came from above that searches were run a certain way, from the training and the procedures and the way things had always been done, and there was no single person who had decided it, and no single person who could unmake it. And Boone was one old tracker with a thing he'd figured out that didn't fit in any of the boxes. And the boxes won, the way they do. Amos Woody was after all that. That's the part that finished Boone. And it finished him in a way the others hadn't, because the others he could half forgive himself for. Elijah Combs, Zona Franklin, the ones before them, he hadn't known yet. He'd walked past them not knowing there was anything to know, and a man can live with that, barely. Amos Woody was different. Amos Woody went missing in that cove after Boone already knew, after Boone had spent years trying to get somebody to listen. And Boone was on that search, and Boone told them, the first morning, go to the bottom, go to the dead zone, don't trust the calling. And they searched the way they searched. The hasty and the grids and the calling and the listening. And it took 9 days and a dog to find Amos Woody 11 feet off a trail 40 people had walked, in the Laurel, in the dead zone, right where Boone had pointed on the first day. They'd looked there, some, but not the way you have to look in a place like that, not on your hands and knees cutting the Laurel inch by inch, because you can't do that to a whole cove. There isn't the manpower, and so they'd trusted the calling. And the calling doesn't work there, and Amos Woody had been 11 feet away the whole 9 days. And Boone Hicks, who had known, who had tried to tell them, who had stood on that trail the first morning and pointed down into the cove and said, "He's down there and you won't hear him," had walked that trail a dozen times over those 9 days, calling a name that could not carry, to a man 11 feet away who could hear every word of it. He didn't do much searching after Amos Woody. He didn't make a big announcement of it. He just stopped getting in his truck when the phone rang, or he'd go and hang back and not be much use, and pretty soon they stopped calling him, and that was that. 30 years of it, done. And he never went back up into that cove again, not once. And he'd tell you, if you got him talking about it, which wasn't easy, that he still heard it sometimes. The search in his head, the calling going out over that cove and dying in the cold air at the bottom, and himself up on the trail, hollering and down below in the silent place. Somebody he'd come to save, hearing every word, screaming back 40 feet away, and him not hearing a thing and moving on. The cove is still there. It's still up in the snowbird country, off in the Monongahela backcountry above Robbinsville, a deep, steep cove with a creek running loud down the bottom of it, and the laurel grown thick, and the cold air pooling in the low place. And it isn't marked, and nobody's ever marked it. And searches still get run up in that country, the way searches get run, from the point last seen with the calling and the listening. And every so often somebody gets turned around up there and goes downhill and follows the water, and gets funneled down into the bottom of that cove, into the one place where no sound they make will ever carry out, and lies down in the laurel and hears, maybe if they're unlucky enough to still be able to hear, the search moving on the trail 40 feet off, calling a name and screams, and nobody hears them. And that's the thing Boone Hicks could never make anybody understand, and could never get out from under, that it isn't that the cove takes people far away where you can't find them, it's that it takes them close, right there, near enough to touch, and keeps them quiet. There's a cove up in that country where you can stand 40 feet from a person screaming and not hear a sound. Lost people keep ending up in it, down in the one silent place. And the searches walk right past them, calling their names, and it isn't marked on anything. And it never has been. Boone Hicks stopped going up there. He said the worst of it was never how far away they were, it was how close. He took the name off first. That was how you did it, name first. And Clell Napier had done it 100 times that year. Scraped a drowned place off a map with a razor and a bit of art gum, because they were making a lake, and the lake didn't need names under it. Redwine Cove came off clean. 2 words in a fine draftsman's hand on the linen sheet, and then a little dust of ink and eraser crumbs on the back of his wrist. And then nothing. Just the pale blank paper where the cove had been, waiting for him to draw the water in over it. It was a Tuesday. He was always sure about that it was a Tuesday, even years later when he wasn't sure about much else. He didn't think it meant anything, taking the name off. It was the smallest part of the job, and by the time he understood that it might have meant something, the name was already gone for more than the map. You have to know what the work was in those years to see why a man like Clell Napier ended up doing it and never talking about it after. In the early 1940s, the Tennessee Valley Authority was building dams up and down these mountains, faster than anybody had ever built anything. The TVA had been going since the early 30s, damming the rivers for flood control and for electricity. And when the war came, the pace turned into something close to frenzy, because the war ran on power. Aluminum for the airplanes took power, oceans of it, and there were other works down at Oak Ridge that took even more and that nobody was allowed to speak of. And so the dams went up around the clock, in shifts floodlit at night. Thousands of men in a rush that people who saw it never forgot. The one Clell worked on was over on the French Broad River in East Tennessee, in the country between Sevierville and Newport, Sevier County and Jefferson, and Cock, good river bottom farm country. Douglas Dam, they called it. They built the whole thing in a little over a year, which was thought to be impossible, and when they closed it, the water came up behind it and made a long lake over a great deal of the finest bottomland in that part of the state, more than 30,000 acres of it, farms that families had worked for 150 years. There's a lake there now, Douglas Lake, and it looks like it belongs, the way they all do. Under it is a whole country that people used to live in. Clell was a surveyor and a draftsman, a mapping man. He was local, is the thing, a Cock County man himself, and that was partly why they'd taken him on, because he knew the ground, knew the roads and the fords and the family lines, and which hollow ran where. When they were mapping a reservoir, they needed men who could read the country, and Clell could read it better than most because it was his own. He'd started out running lines in the field, out with the transit and the chain, walking the taking line. The flowage line, they called it. The mark on the ground below which everything would be underwater, setting the markers, mapping what was there. And then, because he had the neat hand and the patience for it, they'd moved him more and more to the drawing side, to the table, where the field notes got turned into the finished maps. And here's what the finished maps were, and I want to be plain about it, because it took Clell himself a while to really look at what he was doing. When you flood a country, you don't just build the dam. You have to remake the maps. The old maps show the world that was, the roads and the towns and the churches and the little places up the hollows. And once the water's over all of it, those maps are wrong. They show a world that doesn't exist anymore. So the mapping men go through and they make the new maps, the ones that show the lake. And making the new map means taking the old world off of it. You erase the roads that will be underwater. You erase the buildings. You take the names off the drowned places, and you draw the shoreline in, and you fill it with the flat blue of the reservoir, and where there used to be a valley with people in it, there is now just water on the paper, clean and empty, and that is the official map. That is the map that goes in the files and the courthouses and the government offices, the map that is now true, and the old one is filed away or thrown out. Clell did the work for the better part of a year. Farm after farm, road after road, little place after little place, scraped off and drawn over as water. He said it never bothered him much, the ordinary version of it. The people were being bought out and moved. The appraisers had been through. The money had changed hands, hard as it was, and it was the war, and it was going to happen whether he drew it or not, and so he drew it. Somebody had to. He told himself that a good deal. Somebody had to. Redwine Cove was one of the small ones. It was up a cove off the river bottom, a little farming settlement. I don't think it was ever more than 8 or 10 families. The Sutphens and the Gilliams and a few others, up a good ways where the cove pinched in toward the ridge. There was a store and a framed church, and a scatter of houses and barns, and a burying ground on a bench of ground above the creek, where the cove's dead had been laid for generations. It was the kind of place that was too small for most maps to bother with, even before anybody wanted it gone. It sat low, though, low enough to be under the new lake, and so it was in the take, and so it came to Clell's table like all the rest. But Redwine Cove was different in one way, and the difference came down through Grover Wiseman. Grover Wiseman was Clell's supervisor on the mapping side, a TVA man, not a bad man, Clell always said, just a man in the middle of a thing with people over him he answered to and couldn't always name. And one day Grover came to Clell's table with the Redwine Cove sheets, and he had particular instructions about that one, and the instructions did not come from Grover, that was clear. Grover was passing them along, and where they came from above him, Grover either didn't know or wouldn't say. And the instruction was this: Redwine Cove wasn't just to be flooded on the map like the others, shown underwater with a note. It was to be taken out entirely, removed, made so the map read as if there had never been anything there at all. No name struck through with the little dotted line they used for a drowned place. No dot for the store or the church. No cross for the burying ground. Nothing. The cove was to be redrawn as empty river bottom and then filled with the lake, so that anybody looking at the finished map would see only water over a bend of the valley where, as far as the paper was concerned, no one had ever lived. Clell asked why. He said he asked, once, mild, the way you'd ask. And Grover gave him a couple of the reasons that go round in that kind of work. The title was clouded, was one, some old tangle in the deeds up there that made the condemnation messy. And it was cleaner to make the place vanish than to leave a trail of bad paper under the water. There was some trouble with the buyout. Was another, some of the Redwine Cove people had been hard about leaving, and there was bad feeling, and it was thought best to just close the book on the whole cove. Reasons like that. Administrative reasons. And Grover said, plainly, in a lowered voice, that it had come down that they wanted it gone, not flooded, gone, off the record, as if it had never been, and that Clell was to do it in order and do it thorough, and not to make a thing of it. And Clell, who was a government man, in the middle of a war, doing a job somebody had to do, said, all right. And he did it. He even did it in order, because Grover had said in order, and because that was how you worked a sheet anyway, methodical. He did the name first, Redwine Cove, off, the way I told you, name first, on a Tuesday. Then, over the next while, he did the roads, the little dirt road that ran up the cove and the ford at the creek. He erased, the country redrawn as if the road had never been graded. Then he did the buildings, the store and the church and the houses, the small, careful dots and squares gone, art gum and razor, until the cove was blank. Then he did the burying ground, the cross that marked it, off. And I'll come back to the burying ground, because it was the burying ground that finally made Clell stop pretending he didn't see what was happening. And then, last, he redrew the land itself, smoothed the contours as if it were only an empty bend, and drew the shoreline through it, and filled it with the flat blue of the lake. Name, roads, buildings, graves, and then the very shape of the place, erased in that order over a matter of weeks, until Red Wine Cove was nothing on the map but water. The first sign came before he'd even finished. It came while he was still in the middle of the sequence. And that's part of why he didn't connect it at first, because at first there was nothing to connect. It was the name. He'd taken the name off the map, and then out in the world the name started going too. It came to him in small ways at first. A piece of mail he heard, sent up to somebody who'd lived in Red Wine Cove, came back marked no such place. And everybody said, well, of course, the post's a mess with all the moving, and thought no more of it. But then, Clell, who had reason to check things against the field notes, went looking in some older records for the name Red Wine Cove, county records, and found it harder to lay hands on than it should have been. An entry crossed out here, a page that should have had it and didn't, and he told himself records are always a mess. And then he was talking to a man, a Sevier County man who'd have known the whole country. And he mentioned Red Wine Cove, and the man's face went blank for a second, just a second. And he said, now where's that at? And Clell described it. Up the cove past such and such, and the man said, oh, and nodded. But Clell had the feeling the man was nodding to be polite, that the name had gone out of him for a moment, and he'd caught it back only from the description. It was nothing. Every single one of these things was nothing. And Clell told himself so, and the thing about the whole business, the thing that Clell said kept him from ever being able to make anybody believe it, was that at every single step, it was nothing. It was always something that had an ordinary reason, right up until you stood back and saw the order of it, because it went in order. That was what he couldn't get around in the end. He'd taken the name off first, and the name went first, out of the mail and the records and out of people's mouths. And then he'd taken the roads off second, and the roads went second. The road up Red Wine Cove was going to be underwater anyway, so its being closed and torn up was nothing. Of course, they tore up the roads. But Clell went up that way once, before the water, for some reason of the work, meaning to drive up the Cove Road, and he could not find where it turned off. He knew the country. It was near his own country. He knew that road turned off the river road at a certain place, and he drove that stretch twice, slow, and there was no turn, no old road cut, no gap in the trees where a road had been, just the hillside come down whole to the river road as if a road had never gone up that cove at all. He sat in his truck a while. He told himself the TVA crews had already graded it over. They did that, closed roads, and that a road can be wiped off the ground fast when men set to it. But it hadn't looked wiped over. It had looked like nothing had ever been there. And he'd taken it off the map second, and here it was, second. He started keeping his own private note after that. That's a thing about Clell that I hold on to, because it's the most human part of it. He got scared, the quiet, slow kind of scared, and the thing a mapping man does when he's scared of losing something is he writes it down. He took a piece of paper, plain paper, his own, not government paper, and he wrote at the top, Red Wine Cove. And under it, he wrote down everything he could still get hold of. The families, the Sutvins and the Gilliams and the others, the store and who ran it, the church, the burying ground and some of the names in it that he knew, the way the road turned off and ran up the creek. He wrote it all down and he folded it and he kept it in his own pocketbook, private, an anchor, a thing to hold the cove down with, because he'd started to understand that the cove was coming loose from the world in the same order he'd cut it loose from the paper, and he thought, if I keep my own record, then it can't all go. There'll be this, at least. And then it went to the buildings and the records, third, the way he'd done third. And this was where it got past small. He went, deliberately now, to the courthouse, one of the county seats, to find the deeds and the church records and the plat, the real full record of Red Wine Cove that had to exist. Because a place with 10 families and a store and a church and 150 years leaves a mountain of paper. And it was thin. It was wrong. It was not there the way it should have been. There were deeds that referred to Red Wine Cove parcels, and the parcels themselves were hard to place, described by meets and bounds off of landmarks that the clerk couldn't locate. The church, which would have had its own register going back generations, marriages and funerals, that register was said to have been lost, water damaged, misplaced in a move, one of those things, and nobody could produce it. It was all the ordinary excuses, the ordinary way records get lost, except that it was every record of one specific place, all at once, and it was happening in the order he'd drawn. He stood at that courthouse counter and he felt the floor of the thing go out from under him, because there was no longer any way to tell himself it was coincidence. A name going, and then a road, and then the buildings and the paper. In that sequence, the exact sequence he'd worked the sheet, was not coincidence. It was his map. The world was erasing itself to match his map, in the order he'd made the erasures, as if the map had been the thing holding the real place up. And once he'd unmade the map, the real place had no reason to stay, and was following the paper down into blankness, one item at a time. He went to Grover Wiseman. He had to. He didn't say it plain, because how could he? But he went to Grover and he asked him about Red Wine Cove. Careful, and he said something was wrong. The records were gone. The road was gone. And Grover, and Clell said he'd never forget this. Grover looked at him for a long moment, and then Grover said, "Real quiet," he said. "Clell, I don't know what you're talking about." And Clell said, "Red Wine Cove, up past so-and-so, we took it off the sheets. You brought me the instructions." And Grover Wiseman, who had personally carried those sheets to Clell's table and stood over him and told him in a lowered voice that it had come down that they wanted it gone, Grover Wiseman looked at him with no lie in his face, none, an honest blank, and said he didn't know any Red Wine Cove and didn't recall any special instructions, and asked Clell if he was feeling all right. And Clell understood, standing there, that it had taken Grover too, that Grover wasn't covering, that whatever above Grover had wanted the cove gone had gotten Grover too, cleaned him out, and that the order to erase Red Wine Cove had itself been erased, had gone up the chain into wherever it came from and vanished. So that now there was no order and no orderer and no cove, and soon there would be no one at all who remembered that any of it had ever been but Clell Napier, standing at a desk with a folded piece of paper in his pocket. Then it went to the graves. Fourth, the burying ground. I said I'd come back to it. When you flood a country, you can't flood the dead. You're not allowed to, and people won't stand for it. So before the water comes up, the graves in the take have to be moved. The TVA did this, and the Corps did it on their projects. And it is one of the grimmest things in the whole grim business. Crews go into the cemeteries that are going to be underwater, and they open the graves, everyone. And they take up what's there, and they move it to new ground above the line and bury it again, and they keep records, careful records, of who was moved from where to where. So the families can find their people. Thousands of graves over all those projects. It's real, and it's documented, and it's terrible, and it was supposed to have happened to the burying ground in Red Wine Cove, the little bench above the creek with the coves dead in it going back to the first families. And there was no record that it had. There was no record that the burying ground had ever been there to move. Clell went at this the hardest of anything, because by now some of the Red Wine Cove families, scattered around wherever they'd landed after the buyout, had started to notice that they couldn't find their dead. A Sutphin man came looking, wanting to visit his mother's grave, his people's graves, wanting to know where the TVA had moved them to, and there was no record of a Red Wine Cove cemetery in the relocation files. Not that it had been moved to such and such a place, which would have been an answer. There was simply nothing. No cemetery there to begin with, said the paper. The relocation crews, when Clell tried to trace it, had no record of ever going up that cove, no record of opening a single grave there, because on the maps they worked from, the maps Clell had made, there was no burying ground in Red Wine Cove and never had been. There was only the flat blue of the lake, and so no crew had ever been sent, and so the dead of Red Wine Cove had gone under the water in their graves, uncounted, unmoved, unrecorded, and now there was no paper anywhere to say they had ever been buried or married or born, and their descendants could not prove that their own people had ever existed, because he had taken the little cross off the sheet, fourth in its turn, and the graves had gone forth, down into blankness with everything else. That Sutphin man, and there was a Gilliam too, Manson Gilliam, who came around about the same thing. They were the ones who made Clell finally break with the whole business, because they still remembered. They were the last ones who did, and Clell knew it. And he did a thing he wasn't supposed to do, which was he tried to help them, tried to get the record set right, and got nowhere, because there was nothing to set right. There was only absence, and you can't argue with absence. You can't take absence to a courthouse. And he watched over the next while as it took even them. This is the part Clell could hardly get through when he told it. He'd go to see Otho Sutphin, the old man, the one who'd come looking for his mother's grave, and the first time Otho was full of it, angry, grieving, sharp with every detail of the cove, the store, the church, his mother's stone where it sat. And Clell would go back some weeks later, and Otho would be dimmer on it, vague, would say the name Red Wine Cove slow like he was reaching for it. And Clell went back a third time, near the end. And Otho Sutphin looked at him kindly and a little confused, and said he didn't believe he'd ever lived in any such place, that he'd been raised over on the other side of the county, and where had Clell gotten the idea he was from a cove? And it wasn't that Otho was lying, and it wasn't that Otho had gone simple, because he was clear on everything else, sharp as ever on everything but that. It was that the cove had been lifted out of him, clean, the way you'd lift a name off a map, and something else, a whole other ordinary childhood, had come in to fill the blank. So that Otho Sutphin now remembered a life that left no room for Red Wine Cove at all. Fifth, the memory, the last thing. Clell had redrawn the very shape of the land last, smoothed the contours as if the cove had never been a cove, and now the shape of it was going out of the minds that had held it, the last place it still lived, and being smoothed over with something else. And it started coming for Clell. That was the end of it, really, for him. When he understood it, had started coming for him, too. He'd catch himself unable to see the store in his mind, the store he'd walked into as a young man, a blank where it had been. He'd reach for Gilliam's first name and it wouldn't come. He'd look at the country up that way and have trouble believing there had ever been a road, even though he'd driven it, even though he'd stood in his truck and been unable to find where it turned off. And now he was having trouble holding on to even that, even the memory of not being able to find it. He was a mapping man, and he understood exactly what was happening to him. He was being erased of it, in order, the way the world had been, the way the paper had been, and he knew there was one thing standing between him and the last of it, one anchor. And that was the folded piece of plain paper in his pocketbook with Red Wine Cove at the top in his own careful hand. He'd take it out and read it to hold on. And this is where Clell's account ends, more or less, and where you'll understand why I say there's no proving any of it now, why even I, piecing it together, could never run it to ground. The paper started to go too. Not the paper itself. The paper was there. He kept it his whole life. I've been told it existed to the end. But what was on it? He said the ink on it faded, though he'd written it in good ink, faded to where the words got hard to read, and then he said, and this is the thing, he said he'd take it out and read the name at the top, Red Wine Cove, and read the families under it, and it would mean less to him every time. That he could read his own handwriting, the words were words, but the pull went out of them, so that he'd look at Red Wine Cove written in his own hand and feel nothing. No cove come up in his mind behind the words, just letters, just a thing he'd apparently written once for a reason he could no longer feel. The record survived, and the meaning drained out of it, which is worse, in a way, than losing the record, because he was left holding proof he couldn't believe. A note in his own hand about a place that no longer rose in him when he read its name, and no way on earth to tell whether he'd written down something real and lost it, or written down a thing that had never been. He kept the paper the rest of his life. He never did more of that mapping work, quit the drawing side not long after, though he stayed with the TVA at other things a while, and the water came up over the French broad bottoms and made Douglas Lake, which is a fine big lake that thousands of people fish and boat on, and which shows, on every map there is, only water over a certain bend of the valley, water and empty shoreline, nothing under it, no cove, no cross, no name. I got this from Clell himself, late an old man, through people who knew him, and from a little of what he left. And I'll tell you honestly that I could not confirm one word of it, and that this is exactly what you would expect if it were true. There is no Red Wine Cove in any record I could find. There is no cove of that name on any map, old or new, in that county. There is no relocation file, no church register, no deed I could run down, no Sutphin or Gilliam who ever heard of the place. There is nothing, anywhere, to say it was ever real, which proves nothing, because nothing is precisely what would be there. And there is one old man's folded paper, which, by the time I heard of it, was said to be so faded you couldn't make the words out, with a name at the top that no longer rises in anybody's mind when they read it. Clell said, near the end, the thing that I keep, the only thing he seemed sure of anymore, he said he was sure it had been a Tuesday, the day he took the name off. He couldn't have told you by then whether the cove was real or a thing he'd dreamed and couldn't shake, whether he'd erased a true place or invented a false one and then grieved it. He'd lost the ground under all of it. But he was sure it had been a Tuesday, and he held on to that one crumb, because it was the last thing they hadn't taken, and a man will hold on to anything. There's a bend in Douglas Lake where the water sits over a cove, and the maps show nothing under it, and that's the truth now. The maps are right. There's nothing there. An old man wrote a name on a piece of paper once, so it couldn't be lost, and then he couldn't read what he'd meant by it. Some things, once they're taken off the map, don't seem to have anywhere left to be. The first thing anybody told Rena Trantham about the job wasn't the goats, and it wasn't the flowers. It was the line. Vester walked her out to it that first morning, up on the bald, before she'd had a cup of anything hot. He didn't point out the view, because there wasn't one. The whole ridge was socked in, clouds sitting on the grass so thick she couldn't see the far fence. He walked her along the edge of the open ground with his hand held out flat at his waist, like a man smoothing a bedsheet, and he said, "This here is the line. You keep it right here. You don't take it out wider, and you don't let it come in on you." She said, "Sure, okay." She figured that was just how an old man talked about a fence. It took her most of that summer to understand he'd meant it a whole different way than that. She came up to the Roan the way most seasonal people come up, which is to say she needed the work, and the work needed a body that didn't mind weather. Rena Trantham had done trail crew down in the Smokies, and a couple summers cutting brush for a conservancy over toward the Blue Ridge. And by the time she took the goat contract, she was somewhere in her late 30s and past the age where she thought a hard summer would kill her. The job was up on the high balds of the Roan Highlands, that long green spine that runs the state line between Tennessee and North Carolina, above the town of Roan Mountain on one side, and Bakersville on the other. If you've ever driven up to Carver's Gap in June to see the rhododendron, you've stood right at the foot of it. You park in the gap, and the Appalachian Trail crosses the road there, and you walk up out of the trees onto grass that just keeps going, bald after bald, round bald, and then Jane, and then grassy ridge, mile after mile of open meadow up over 5,000 feet, where by every rule of the mountain there ought to be forest, and there isn't. That's the part nobody can explain, and I want to be plain that this part is true. Those balds have no good reason to be there. It's not the altitude. Because there's spruce and fir growing higher than the grass, right above it, thick and dark. It's not that the ground won't hold trees. Left alone, the balds close in. The forest walks up into them a little more every year, blackberry and hawthorn and alder first, then the young firs behind. Scientists have argued about it for 100 years, and the honest ones will tell you they don't know why the balds are bald. Ice Age relics, some say. Old buffalo grounds. Indian burning. Every answer has a hole in it. Now, what everybody does agree on is that a bald left to itself doesn't stay a bald. Somebody has to keep it open. And on the Roan, for as long as anybody can point to, somebody always has. That was the job. A herd of goats, 32 of them the first year Rena counted, that lived up on the mountain through the warm months and ate the mountain back. She'd move them across the open ground, a section at a time inside a run of portable electric fence, let them browse a patch down to nothing, then pick the whole fence up and set it forward and do it again. The goats went after exactly the stuff the science didn't want up there, the blackberry canes and the hawthorn whips and the little firs no taller than your knee. The pitch she got when the Conservancy people drove her up and showed her around was all about the rare things. There's a lily up there, Gray's lily, a dark red bell of a flower that grows almost nowhere else, and it needs the sun, and it dies out under brush. There's the rhododendron and the flame azalea that pull the crowds. There's the view, which on a clear day runs to Grandfather Mountain and past. Keep the bald open, they said, and you keep all of that. Let it grow in, and you lose it. It made perfect sense. It was a good, clean reason, and she believed every word of it, and I'll say now that it was not the reason the mountain had been kept. It was just the reason they'd hung on it lately. Vester was the local they'd brought on with her. He had to be past 70, a narrow old man with hands like tool handles who lived down a hollow off the Tennessee side and had, in one way or another, been connected to the grazing on that mountain his whole life. The Conservancy called him a consultant. What he really was the man who knew the ground. He knew where the springs came up and where the fence would hold and where the wind would take a tent, and he knew the line. He was up there with her a lot those first weeks, and then less as she got the hang of it, but he never fully went away. He'd appear. She'd be moving fence in the fog and look up, and there he'd be at the edge of the grass, quiet, watching where she'd set it. The first small wrong thing happened maybe 2 weeks in, and it was so small she almost didn't keep it. She'd been working the north end of Round Bald, and she got ahead of herself, feeling good, and she cleared a strip a little past where the open ground had been, took the goats out into a fringe of low brush that was clearly headed toward forest anyway. In her head, she was doing exactly what they'd hired her for. More open ground, more sun, more lily. She was proud of it. Vester came up that evening and stood looking at the strip she'd taken, and he didn't say anything for a while. Then he pulled 2 of her fence stakes and walked them back into the old edge, to the line, and reset them there, patient, like a man straightening a picture on a wall. She said something about how the goats had liked it out there, plenty more they could eat. He said, keep it to the line. That was all. Not angry. Just closed, the way you'd correct a child who'd colored past the border and didn't understand yet that the border was the point. She let it go. You do, at first. But it sat wrong, because it ran backwards to everything they'd told her. If the whole idea was to fight the forest and hold the open ground, why would you ever stop the goats short of the brush? Why leave a fringe you could easily take? She'd have understood don't let it grow in. Everybody understood that. What she couldn't square was the other half. Don't take it wider. Don't go past. As if the size of the thing mattered as much as the openness of it. As if there were a shape it was supposed to be. And her job wasn't to make the bald bigger. It was to keep it exactly the bald it had always been. She might never have chased it if the weather had held. But the Roan makes its own weather. And a lot of it is fog. There were whole days you couldn't work. The cloud down so low and wet the goats just stood. And she'd come off the mountain and have time on her hands in the little rented room she had, down in Roan Mountain Town. And she got curious. That's the whole engine of this thing. A person got curious about a rule that didn't fit. She started with the Conservancy's own paperwork, the grazing management binder they'd handed her. And it was all recent, all the modern reasons. Lily and view and habitat, plans drawn up in the last couple of decades with a lot of talk about baseline conditions and encroachment rates. But every now and then, a document would reference an older one, the way papers do. A lease that mentioned a prior lease, a survey that mentioned the survey before it. And she followed those references down the way you'd follow a creek down off a ridge. And they took her off the Conservancy's shelf and over into older hands. Some of it was at the county in Bakersville in boxes nobody had opened in years. Some of it was with the old grazing association that had run cattle and sheep on the Roan back before any of the conservation people existed. And some of it, the oldest of it, Vester had himself in a tin box in his own house. And she didn't see that part until much later. But even the county boxes were enough to raise the hair on her, because the balds up there weren't always about lilies and hikers. Go back far enough, and they were pasture, plain and simple. All through the 1800s, farmers from both sides of the mountain drove their cattle and sheep up to the Roan for the summer, up onto that high grass where it was cool and the flies were fewer, and they kept the balds open the old way, by grazing them hard and by burning the brush back. There were herders' huts up there. There was, for a while, a great rambling hotel that straddled the state line right on the summit. The Cloudland, built in the 1880s, a place where people came to escape the heat, and it's long gone now, not a board of it left. So there was a real, ordinary reason the mountain got kept open in those days. Money. Grass for stock. Nobody needed a mystery to explain a man putting his cows where the grass was good. Here's what got her, though. The grazing records went back. They kept going back, and the herds got smaller, and then they stopped. The cattle drives died out generations ago. The hotel burned or fell. The whole economic reason for the open mountain dried up and blew away. And the keeping of the line did not stop. It just went quiet and kept going. There was a stretch of years in there where there was no money in it, no stock, no hotel, no tourists yet to speak of, no science, no reason on God's earth that anybody wrote down. And still the same particular acreage on that ridge got kept open by hand. And somebody went up every year, in the lean years, in the empty years, when there was nothing to gain by it, and cut the brush back to the same line their people had cut it back to, and then came home. And the names repeated. That was the thing she kept turning over. In the grazing books, in the association ledgers, over and over across the decades, the same handful of families showed up tied to that particular open ground. Not the whole mountain, this ground. The stretch Vester called the line. She started keeping a list of who'd held it, working backwards, and it read like a chain. Vester Ollis, now. Before him, going back, a woman named Cordy Silvers, who'd held it a long time, decades, into old age. And before Cordy, further back than Rena expected to find anything, a man named Elsie Rominger. The books got thin and hard to read down at that end. The ink gone brown, the hands changing, and she couldn't always tell who was who, but the shape of it held. It passed down. It didn't pass by sale, and it didn't pass by any office or title she could find. It passed the way a chore passes in a family, from an old one to a younger one, quiet, without ceremony. Somebody would hold the line for a lifetime, and then somebody younger would be holding it, and the old name would drop out of the books, and you understood without being told that the old one had died and the young one had taken it up. 200 years, near enough that she could trace, probably longer than that behind the paper. The same open ground, kept to the same shape, by hand, by a line of people who didn't stop when the reason stopped. She took all this to Vester the way you'd take it to anybody, thinking he'd have some ordinary answer she'd feel foolish for not seeing. They were up on Grassy Ridge the day she asked him, or Jane Bald. She was never sure which. It was a clear evening for once, the cloud broken up, the light going long and gold across the grass, and the goats settled in their bells going soft down the slope, and she laid it out for him. The old records, the names. Cordy, Elsie, the ones behind them she couldn't read. 200 years of somebody keeping this exact patch open through years when there wasn't a dime or a cow or a soul to see it. And she asked him the only question there was to ask. She asked him what it was for, and Vester didn't answer it. Not really. He did the thing old people do where they answer a nearby question instead. He started telling her how he'd come to it. He said, when he was a young man, it was his uncle held it, and before that, a woman he called Miss Cordy. And he talked about her some, how she'd been up on that mountain in every weather into her 80s, how she'd shown him the line herself the summer before she passed, walked it with him just like he'd walked it with Rena, her hand out flat at her waist. He said he didn't think anything of it at the time. That's close to how he put it, and it's the part that stays with people. He said he didn't even know to think it was strange. It was just what his uncle did and what Miss Cordy did before him, so it was what you did. You went up. You kept it to the line. You didn't let it grow in, and you didn't take it wider. And when you got old, you showed it to the next one, and you didn't make a speech about it. You just showed them where the line was and told them to keep it there. She pushed him. She said, but why not wider? If the whole point is open ground, why does it matter if it's bigger? And he was quiet a while, looking off down the ridge, and then he said the thing she carried the rest of her life. He said, you keep it to the line so it stays where you can see it. She said, see what? And he didn't answer that at all. He just looked at her, and then he looked back down the mountain. And after a minute, he said it was getting on and they ought to move the goats before dark. And that was the end of it. She said there was nothing in his face she could point to, no fear, nothing dramatic. It would be easy to make it more than it was. He wasn't a spooky old man in a story. He was a tired old man on a mountain who'd been asked a question he plainly did not have words for, or wouldn't say, and who closed the door on it the way you'd close a door on weather. But the words stayed. Keep it where you can see it. She didn't sleep well that night, and it wasn't the wind. This is where it stopped being about old paper and started being about that summer, and it's the part that made Rena a person who couldn't just walk away from it. She sometimes stayed up on the mountain overnight with the herd. Not always. But when the weather was bad or the goats were in a section far from the gap, it was easier to camp up there than to hike down and back. And she had a little tent she'd set in the lee of the fir where the wind wouldn't get it. And the goats, up to a point, are good company. They're loud and dumb and warm, and they have bells. And the bells are how you know where they are in the dark and the fog. You lie in the tent and you hear them shifting and cropping and the bells going, and it's almost restful. You learn the sound of a settled herd. There was a night in July when it caught up with her. The herd was bedded down easy, bells going soft. Nothing wrong with the goats at all, and that was almost the whole of it, that the animals were fine. It was Rena the mountain got to. She'd gone out from the tent to check the water trough, and she stopped partway across the open ground, in the fog. And she couldn't have said at first what stopped her, except that standing out there in the dark, she understood all at once what the clearing was really for, not the flowers. She'd quit believing the flowers weeks back. What she understood was that the bald was the one piece of that whole mountain where there was nothing to stand behind. Everywhere else, up there, in the trees and the rocks and the folds of the ground, you could put your back to something, not on the open ground. The open ground was open so that anything on it could be seen, from anywhere around it, all the way across, with nowhere to get out from under the sky. That was what keeping it to the line did. It held a piece of ground bare so that whatever stood on it stood plain in the middle of it, watchable. From a dark it couldn't see into. Keep it where you can see it. And she was the thing on it, alone, in the fog, in the exact center of the one place on that mountain kept clear so it could be looked at, and she could see nothing at all past the little reach of her own light. And everything that wasn't her, the whole black ring of trees and slope and cloud, could see her just fine. She stood there longer than made sense, testing the thought to see if it was foolish. She told herself it was the fog, that fog does that to a person alone, closes the world down to a few feet and fills the rest with whatever you carried up there. She told herself there wasn't another soul for miles, which was true, the nearest one asleep down in Roan Mountain town, an hour's walk and better than 1,000 feet below her. She told herself the open ground was for the lily and the view and the hikers, the reasonable things they'd hired her for, and none of it touched the plain fact her body had already settled on, which was that she was standing in the middle of a place that had been kept bare and clear on purpose, for longer than the country had been a country, and that a place is only ever kept bare like that for one reason, which is so a person can see what's standing in the middle of it. She got off the open ground. She didn't run. There was nothing to run from. But she walked back to the tree line faster than she'd walked anywhere in a while, and she got in against the fir with her back against something solid. And she stayed like that until it was light. Nothing came. Nothing ever came. The whole summer, no shape and no sound. Only the fog and the wet grass and the black trees, and a woman standing exposed in the middle of a field that somebody had kept open for 200 years so that it could be seen. But she never again liked being out on the open bald after dark. She stopped thinking of it as a view. She started thinking of it as a place where you could be looked at, and where the looking only ran the one way. Then came the part with the patch, and that was the one that broke something open in her for good. It was later in the summer, into August, and she'd fallen behind. There'd been a run of bad weather, days she couldn't work, and the brush doesn't wait for you, and there was a stretch along the far eastern edge of the ground, out where the line ran close to the drop, that had started to green in on her. Blackberry mostly, and some hawthorn, a low fringe of it coming up over the edge where the goats hadn't been in a couple weeks. She saw it, and she made a note to get to it. And then the weather turned again, and she didn't. It nagged at her. It's the kind of thing that nags a person who takes pride in the work, a patch you know is slipping and you can't get to. And then one morning she hiked out to that eastern edge to finally deal with it, and it was already done. The patch had been cut. The whole fringe of blackberry and hawthorn that had come up over the line, cut back clean, back to the line, cut to the exact edge the open ground was supposed to hold, and stopped there. Not pulled, not grazed, cut. She could see the cut ends of the canes, pale and fresh, low to the ground. Done with a blade of some kind, done recently, within a day or two by the look of it. She stood there over it, and the first thing she felt, honest to God, was relief, because the patch that had been nagging her was handled. And the second thing, coming right up behind the first and cold as the fog, was the question. By who? because she was the only one up there. The goats hadn't done it, that wasn't grazing, and anyway, she'd moved the herd nowhere near it. She hadn't done it. Investor, she was fairly sure, hadn't been up in days. He'd had a bad hip that stretch, and she'd been carrying it all herself. She hiked down that afternoon, and she asked him, "Plain, did you come up and cut the east edge?" And he looked at her, and she said he looked plainly puzzled, not sly, not covering, just an old man who didn't know what she was talking about. He said he hadn't been up on the mountain in over a week, couldn't hardly walk. And she described it, the cut patch, back to the line, fresh. Investor got quiet in that way he had, and he was quiet a long time, and then he said something she didn't understand until she'd said it back to herself 100 times over the years since. He said, "Well, somebody keeps it, that was all. Somebody keeps it. Not, I'll look into it, not that strange, not, who could it have been?" Just a plain fact stated by a man who'd known it his whole life and had, she realized, been half expecting to hear it from her sooner or later. Somebody keeps it. As if the keeping of the line did not, in the end, depend on her, or on him, or on Cordy, or Elsie, or any name in any book. As if the line got kept the way water finds the low ground, whether or not the person whose turn it was got around to it. And she understood, standing in that man's small, clean kitchen with the smell of wood smoke in it, that she was not the one keeping the line. She was just the one whose turn it was to think she was. She asked around after that, carefully, because you learn fast up there that some questions close people's faces, but she asked. And the name that came up, when it came up at all, was Hollis Presnell. Nobody wanted to tell it, and everybody knew it, the way small places hold a story. Hollis Presnell had held the line, or been meant to, back a good while, 2 or 3 turns of the chain ago, before Cordy's time, or right at the edge of it. The dates were soft. And Hollis Presnell, the story went, hadn't kept it. There were different versions of why. One had it that he'd wanted to plant the ground, put it to some use, thought the whole business of cutting brush for nothing was foolishness, which it plainly was on its face. Another had it that he just got old and tired and let a year slip, the way she'd nearly let the east edge slip, only he let the whole thing go. 1 full season, didn't go up, let the line grow in, and then something happened. That's as far as anyone would take it, and they took it in that same low, done voice. Something happened to Hollis Presnell the year he let the line go. Some said he lost his mind, went strange, stopped talking, sat in his house. Some said it wasn't him, it was his family, his people. A bad year, sickness, a death, more than one, more than a year should hold. Nobody would say what exactly, and I've come to think nobody knew what exactly, that it was less a fact than a shape, a warning worn smooth by handing down. What everybody agreed on, in the versions that agreed on anything, was that after Hollis Presnell the line got kept faithful. Whoever took it up after him, and it might have been Cordy or it might have been someone between, took it up and did not let it slip, ever. And the chore that had been slack got tight again and stayed tight. And it stayed tight right down the years to the tin box in Vester Ollis's house and the electric fence in Rena Trantham's hands. The truth, as she told it to me, is that none of this is proof of anything. A man let some brush grow up, and then he had a bad few years, and mountain people, who have had bad years the way everyone's had bad years, made a story of it, because that's what people do. They braid the bad luck into the chore to make the chore make sense. That's the reasonable way to hear it, and I've heard it that way plenty. The trouble is that once Rena had heard it, she found she kept the line differently. She stopped taking the east edge for granted. She got up there in every weather she could, hip or no hip, weather or no weather, and she kept it tight, right to the shape of it. And she stopped telling herself it was about the lily. She caught herself doing it, and she'd think, that's Hollis Presnell. That's what this is. I'm keeping it faithful because of a story about a man I never met. And knowing that didn't stop her doing it. The dread had gotten into the work. That's the honest end of it. Nothing chased her off that mountain. Nothing appeared. The dread just got into the work and stayed there, low, the way the cloud stays down on the Roan for days and you go about your business inside it. She finished the season. The goats came down off the mountain in the fall, the way they always do, before the weather turns hard up there, before the rime ice and the wind that'll knock a person flat, and she saw them loaded and she settled up with the conservancy, and by every outside measure it had been a good summer's work. The balds held, the encroachment beaten back another year, everybody pleased. And they asked her to come back the next season, and she said she'd think about it. And Vester, when she said goodbye to him, an old man on his porch down in the hollow, he told her the way he'd told it before, plain, that if she came back, he'd walk her out to the line again in the spring, and if she didn't, he'd find somebody, or somebody'd find him, and it'd get kept either way. Somebody keeps it. He said it almost kindly that time, like it was meant to let her off the hook, and maybe it was. She didn't go back. I don't fully know why, and I don't think she did either. She got other work, is the plain reason, down in another range, and life moves you along. But there was the other reason under that one, and she'd only half say it. She said she didn't want to be the next name in the book. She'd traced that chain back 200 years, all those people who'd held the line for a lifetime and then handed it down, Vester and Cordy and Elsie and the brown ink names she couldn't read behind them. And she said the thing she was most afraid of was not a shape in the fog. It was the book. It was the idea of her own name going into that chain and staying, and someday some curious young person on a rain day tracing it back and finding her. Rena Trantham. One more link. One more person who went up every year and kept a patch of grass on the Roan open to a line for a reason nobody would write down. She said she didn't want to be kept, the way the line was kept. She did drive back up there once, a few years later. Passing through, she said, though I've wondered about that, whether a person passes through Carver's Gap by accident. She parked in the gap, and she walked up out of the trees onto Roundbald, and it was a clear day, the long green ridge running off north the way it always has, Round and then Jane and then Grassy Ridge, all of it open. All of it held to its old shape against the forest that was already, that day, walking back up into it from below. And there was a herd up there, a different herd, and there was a fence, moved forward a section, fresh cut behind it. And there was a person she didn't know at the far edge of the grass, small in the distance, back turned, working along the line with something in their hands, keeping it to the line, no wider, no less. She didn't go say hello. She stood in the gap and watched a while, and then she got back in her truck and drove down off the mountain, and she said she has not been back since. She keeps up with it a little, from a distance, the way you'd keep a hand near a stove you've been burned on. The balds are still there. Somebody's still up there every summer holding the line, and if you ask them why, they'll tell you about the lily and the view, and the rhododendron that pulls the crowds in June, and every word of that is true, and none of it is old enough. Somebody keeps it. That's the whole of what she was ever told. And the grass on the Roan is still open, right to the line, and nobody up there will say to what. Coy Buckner counted them onto the boat before it was full light. That was the rule. His rule. The one he never broke in all his years on the water. Everybody gets counted on. Everybody gets a life jacket. Everybody gets counted off. He'd stand at the front of the pontoon with the cove still gray around him and the mist coming up off Fontana in long, slow ropes, and he'd touch each person on the shoulder as they stepped down, 1, 2, 3, saying the number under his breath. And he'd write it at the top of the page on a little pad he kept in a plastic bag against the wet. Then at the end of the day, when the sun was going down behind the ridge and everybody was tired and quiet and holding their empty flower buckets, he'd count them off the same way. And the two numbers were supposed to match. For most of his life, they did. It's the years they didn't that he finally told me about, and even then it took him the better part of an evening to get around to it. You have to understand what the water is first, or none of the rest of it lands right. Fontana Lake sits up in the far western corner of North Carolina, in Swain County and a little of Graham, tucked in under the south edge of the Smokies. If you drive to Bryson City and keep going, you'll come to it. It's a long lake, close to 30 miles of it, winding back into the coves, deep and green and cold, and it looks like it's always been there, the way big water always looks. It hasn't. There was a river down at the bottom of it once, the Little Tennessee, and along that river and up the creeks that fed it there were towns, real towns, with churches and stores and post offices and school buildings and roads, Proctor, up Hazel Creek, Bushnell, down where Forney Creek comes in, Judson, Forney, Fontana itself, little places, farming and timber and mining places, families that had been on that ground since before anybody kept good count of the years. And in the early 1940s, the government came and took it. I want to be careful how I say that, because Coy was always careful how he said it, and because it's the kind of thing where the blame runs off in every direction and never quite lands on a face. There was a war on. They needed power, electricity, huge amounts of it, for the aluminum they made airplanes out of, and for other things out at Oak Ridge that nobody was allowed to know about at the time. So they built a dam, Fontana Dam, the tallest dam in the whole eastern half of the country, close to 500 feet of concrete thrown up across the Little Tennessee in about 2 years by men working in shifts around the clock. And when they closed the gates, the water came up behind it, slow at first and then not slow, and it drowned all of it. The towns, the fields, the roads, the church houses. There's a highway down there under the lake, the old 288, that used to run along the river and connect all those places to the rest of the world. It's under the water now. You can't see it. It's just there, at the bottom, a paved road going nowhere anyone can follow. They moved the people out ahead of the water. Somewhere upward of 600 families, more than 1,000 people, bought out and relocated, some willing, most not, hauling what they could to Bryson City or wherever they could land, and leaving the rest to the lake. And here's the part that matters to the story, so I'll slow down on it. When they moved the living, they could not move the dead. Not all of them, There were cemeteries scattered all up in those hills, little family burying grounds and church graveyards, dozens of them, going back generations, and most of them sat up on the ridges above where the water would come, above the waterline. So the graves stayed. The towns went under and the people were scattered to the winds, but the dead stayed right where they'd always been, up on the north shore, in the ground, in the trees, above the new lake, cut off from everybody who loved them by 30 miles of cold, green water. And the government knew that was a cruel thing, or somebody did, because there was a promise made. It's written down, you can find it. An agreement from 1943 between the county and the TVA and the Department of the Interior and whoever else had their hand in it. They promised to build a new road along the north shore to replace the one they'd drowned so the families could drive back in to tend their people's graves. And they started it. They built a piece of it out of Bryson City, a nice paved piece. And then they built a tunnel, a real tunnel bored right through the mountain. And then they stopped. They just stopped. There were reasons given, environmental this and funding that, decisions made somewhere up above where you couldn't get at them, and the road never got built. It runs out of Bryson City, and it goes a few miles, and it ends at that tunnel. And you can walk through the tunnel, people do, and you come out the other side into the woods and there's nothing. The trail peters out. Folks call it the road to nowhere. There's a sign. For 60-some years, the families fought over that broken promise, and in the end, not that long ago, the government paid the county a pile of money to call it settled, $50-some million, and that was that. The road was never built. It's still not built. If you want to get to your grandmother's grave on the north shore of Fontana Lake, there's only one way, and there has only ever been one way since the water came up. Somebody has to take you across in a boat. That was Coy Buckner's work for the best part of 30 years. He didn't invent it. There was a tradition already, an old one. In those mountains, they kept what they called Decoration Day, and they still do, all over the southern Appalachians. It's a day set aside, usually in the late spring or the early summer when the families come to the cemetery and clean it up, cut the grass, pull the weeds, straighten the stones, scrub the moss off the names, and they decorate. That's where the word comes from. They bring flowers, real ones and paper ones and plastic ones, and they set them on every grave, not just their own kin, every grave, so nobody's left bare. And then, most places, they'd have a dinner on the ground, spread the food out on the graves themselves on clean cloths, and there'd be preaching and singing, and it was half a mournful thing and half a homecoming, a way for the scattered family to come back to one place once a year and stand together over the ones who'd gone before. When the water took the north shore, the National Park Service ended up with all that land. It's inside the Great Smokies Park now, and the decoration days didn't stop. The families wouldn't let them stop. So an arrangement grew up, informal at first and then more organized, where the park and the Descendants Association would run boats across the lake on the decoration days, spring into summer, one cemetery at a time on a schedule, and ferry the families over the water to spend the day up at the graves and then bring them back before dark. Different cemeteries got different days, Proctor one weekend, Bone Valley another, the little ones up Forney and Noland and Chambers Creek on their own days. And somebody had to run the boats. Before Coy, it was a man named Emmett Honeycutt. Emmett had been doing it since Coy was a boy, since back in the 50s and 60s. A big, slow, quiet man who'd grown up on the lake and knew every cove and every stump under the surface that would tear the bottom out of a boat if you didn't know it was there. Emmett ferried the decoration crowds for decades, and toward the end of it, when his eyes were going and his hands shook, he took young Coy on to help, and then to run it, and then it was Coy's. Coy took it over for good around 1990, near as he could put it, though he'd been running most of the trips himself for a few years before that, while Emmett sat up front and watched the water and told him where the stumps were. So that's the shape of the thing. Every spring, from about the time the dogwoods came out, Coy would load his pontoon at a landing on the south shore, before dawn on the appointed day, with whatever family had graves in whatever cemetery was on the calendar, and he'd carry them across Fontana and up into the coves and land them below their cemetery, and they'd hike up and spend the day with their dead, and he'd sit with the boat and wait, and at evening he'd carry them home. Some days it was 6 or 8 people. Some days, for the bigger cemeteries with a lot of living descendants, it might be 40 or 50 across several trips. And every single day, without fail, Coy kept his count, on and off. It was a safety thing. The water was dangerous and cold and deep, and the woods up there were big and easy to get turned around in, and Emmett had drilled it into him. You always know how many you took across. You always bring back the same number. You never, ever go home light. For the first years, the numbers matched. Coy never thought about it. It was just a thing he did, like checking the fuel and the life jackets, a number at the top of the page in the morning and the same number at the bottom in the evening, and he'd tear the page off and throw it away and not think about it again. The first time it didn't match, he was certain he'd miscounted. He remembered the day pretty well because it was a Forney Creek day, one of the smaller cemeteries up above where the town of Bushnell used to be. And it had been a raw, wet morning with the mist so thick coming across the main channel that he'd had to run slow and blind, following his own memory of the water more than anything he could see. He'd counted them on at the landing. He was sure of the number. And that evening, tired, chilled through, he counted them off, and there was one more than there should have been, one extra. He counted again. Same. He stood there on the landing in the last of the light with his little pad, and he counted the empty flower buckets and the people getting into their trucks, and he could not make it come out right. He'd taken across a certain number of people, and he'd brought back one more than that. And there's no way in the world for that to happen, because the only way onto the North Shore is his boat, and the only way off, it is his boat. And he'd been sitting with the boat all day. He decided he'd counted wrong in the morning, in the mist, and that was the end of it. What else was he going to decide? But it stuck with him, the way a thing sticks with you when the easy answer doesn't quite fit the hole. And the next spring, he started being more careful. He got a proper sign-in sheet, a clipboard, names, and not just heads. And he'd have everybody print their name in the morning, and he'd check them off in the evening, out loud, one at a time. He told himself and everybody else it was for the park, for the records, in case anybody got hurt. That was true enough. But it was really so it wouldn't happen again, so he'd have names to hang the numbers on, so a miscount couldn't hide in the fog. It happened again anyway, not every year. That's part of what made it so hard to hold on to. If it had happened every trip, he could have found the flaw in his method, but it didn't. It happened maybe one day in 5 or 6, scattered across the springs with no pattern he could see, and it wasn't always the same direction. Most times when it went wrong, he came back one heavy, one more coming off the boat than had signed on in the morning. But 2 or 3 times over the years it went the other way, and he came back one light, one name on his sheet that he could not account for, a person who'd printed their name that morning in his own presence and was simply not on the boat that evening, and was not up at the cemetery when he went and looked and called and was never reported missing by anybody, because when he'd chase it down, when he'd go to the address on his sheet or ask the family, there'd be no such person. The name would be real, an ordinary mountain name, but there'd be nobody attached to it that anybody would own. You can see how a man could go a little crazy with that. Coy didn't, quite. He was a steady man, but he started dreading the count. He'd feel it coming all day, that evening count, sitting up in the cove, waiting for the families to come down from the graves, and his stomach would be tight the whole time. Now I have to bring in the S-steps, because, looking back, Coy came to believe the S-steps were at the middle of it, though he could never once prove that either, and I want to lay it out the way he laid it out for me, slow, because it's the part that people don't forget once they hear it. There was a family that came every year to one particular grave. The grave was up in one of the smaller cove cemeteries on the Forney Creek side, above the drowned town of Bushnell, a little burying ground on a bench of level ground under big hemlocks, 30 or 40 graves, most of them old, the newest of them from before the water came up. And there was one stone there, a modest gray stone that read, Sooty Coffee, with dates on it that made her a young woman when she died, gone before the flood, back in the 20s or thereabouts. And every decoration day for that cemetery, the same family came to tend Sooty Coffee's grave, and they were the S-steps. There was an older man, tall and dry and quiet, and Coy came to know his name was Burl, and a woman, small, with her hair done up the old way, and her name was Icy and Burl S-step. And there were others with them some years, a few more, younger and older, but Icy and Burl were the constant. They were quiet, respectful people, gave no trouble, always thanked him, and they came. And they cleaned Sooty Coffee's grave, and they set their flowers, and they stood a long while, and then they came back down to the boat. Coy ferried the S-steps to Sooty Coffee's grave, he figured, more than 20 years running, and they did not change. He didn't notice it at first. You don't. You see a family once a year for a day, and a year is a long time, and people are people. They all start to blur. But somewhere in there, and he couldn't tell you exactly when the thought first came up out of the water and looked at him, somewhere in there he realized that Icy S-step looked exactly the same as she had the first year he'd carried her across. Not similar. The same face, the same age. The same gray hair done up the same way of holding her flowers against her chest with both hands. And Burl the same, tall and dry, not a day older, not a pound different, not a new line on him. Coy himself was getting old. He could feel it in his hands and his back and his eyes, the same as Emmett had gotten old in front of him. 20 years had gone across all of them. 20 years had gone across everybody who came to those graves, the children grown and the grown gone gray, and the old ones stopped coming and new stones going up. Everybody aged, except the 2 of them, standing over Sooty Coffee's grave, exactly as they'd been the first morning. He told himself it was foolishness, an old man's eyes playing tricks, one year running into the next. He told himself that hard. And then he found the photograph, and after that, he couldn't tell himself anything. It was in Bryson City, in the little museum they keep there, the one about the history of the county and the making of the lake. Coy went in one winter, off-season, just to be out of the house, and they had a whole room about the flooding, the towns that drowned, the families that got moved, and there were photographs all over the walls, old ones, black and white, some of them the size of a door. And there was one, a Decoration Day photograph taken up at one of the North Shore cemeteries not long after the water came up. In the early 50s, by the date on the card beside it, a whole crowd of people gathered among the graves with their flowers, dressed in their Sunday best, squinting into the sun. It was a beautiful, sad picture, and Coy stood in front of it a long time the way you do, looking at the faces. And then he stopped looking and just stood, because two of the faces in that crowd, standing a little apart from the rest, off to one side near a modest gray stone, were Icy and Burl Estep. The same. For more than 40 years before he'd ever carried them across. The exact same faces, the exact same age, Icy holding her flowers against her chest with both hands, and Burl tall and dry beside her. In a photograph taken when Coy Buckner was a small boy. He went home and he couldn't sleep, and the next chance he got, he went and found Emmett Honeycutt, who was very old by then, in a home over near Silva, mostly bedfast, but his mind still came and went clear. And Coy sat with him, and after a while, careful, he asked him. He asked him if he remembered a family named Estep that used to come to a grave up above Bushnell, a sooty coffee grave, up Forney Creek. And Emmett was quiet a good while, looking at the ceiling, and then he said yes. And Coy asked him, did they, when you carried them, did they seem, and he didn't even know how to finish it, and Emmett finished it for him. He said they never got any older. He said it flat the way you'd say it had rained. He said, I carried Icy and Burl Estep across that water for 30 years, and they never got a day older. And I quit asking myself about it because there wasn't any answer to it, and I'll tell you what I told myself, which is that it wasn't my business who came to be decorated, it was only my business to carry them. And then Emmett said one more thing, and Coy said he could hear it exactly the way the old man said it, the way you can hear a thing years later. He said, don't you keep that count so close, Coy. You don't want to know that number. And he wouldn't say any more about it, and he passed that same year, and that was the last Coy ever talked to him. Now Coy was not a man to leave a thing alone once it had gotten into him, even after a warning like that, maybe because of it. So he started to dig, the way you'd dig into anything, into the records, into who these people were, sooty coffee he could find. There were church records, and a few old people who remembered the name from before the water, and she was a real girl, a Bushnell girl, who died young of something ordinary, a fever most likely, back in the 20s, and been buried up on that bench above the town in the family plot. And that was all. A short life and a common death. Nothing strange about Sooty Coffee except that a family kept coming to her a lifetime after everyone who'd have naturally remembered her was themselves dead. The Esteps were harder, and then they were worse than hard. He went at the relocation records, the TVA buyout files, the lists of everybody who'd been moved out ahead of the water in the early 40s. Those exist. They kept good records, names and land parcels and what they'd been paid and where they said they were going. And in among them, on the Bushnell and Forney Creek pages, he found them. Estep. A whole household of Esteps bought out and moved in 1944, listed by name, adults, and their kin. And there, in that 1944 ledger, in the careful government hand, were the names Icy Estep and Burl Estep, listed as grown adults, husband and wife, given their money and moved out and gone, along with the rest, scattered like all the others, which meant if you did the arithmetic, and Coy did it over and over, that the Icy and Burl Estep, who came across his water every spring, unchanged, the same age as in a photograph from the 50s, the same age Coy had first seen them in 1990-something, would have to have been grown adults in 1944. Grown adults, 80 years ago. They would have to be 100 years old and more, well past 100, the both of them, and they were not. They were a settled middle age, and they had been a settled middle age for as long as anybody living had watched them, for as long as there were photographs, for 80 years, coming every spring to a young girl's grave above a town that wasn't there anymore, to clean it and decorate it and stand over it and going home across the water, and never once getting old. He tried to run the S-steps forward, too, out of 1944 to see where they'd landed, and that's where it went from strange to cold, because he couldn't find them landed anywhere. The other families you could trace, they turned up in Bryson City and Silva and Cherokee and Andrews in later records, in phone books, deaths, marriages, the ordinary paper trail of family leaves. The S-steps just stopped. They were moved out in 1944, and then there was nothing. No death records, no later addresses, no descendants he could raise, no living soul named S-step in 3 counties that anybody could point him to. It was as if the family had walked out of Bushnell in 1944 and off the edge of the paper and simply gone on coming to the grave, and nowhere else, forever. There was one more name that showed up on those Forney Creek pages. tangled in with the Esteps, a Slagle family that had married into them somewhere back, and Coy chased the Slagles too, thinking maybe he could come at the Esteps sideways through them. The Slagles at least had left a normal trail, moved to Bryson City, and he found an old Slagle woman who was some far kin, and he asked her about the Esteps, about Icy and Burl, and she went quiet, and she said her mother used to talk about them. He used to say the Esteps never left, and when Coy asked her what that meant, that they never left, she said she didn't know. It was just a thing her mother said. The Esteps never left the water, and she'd never understood it and hadn't thought of it in years and would rather not think of it now, and she asked him to go. So he had names in a ledger and a face in a photograph, and an old man's warning and a saying nobody could explain and no answer, and never any answer, and that is exactly where it stayed. And I want to be honest that it never got past that, because a lot of the pull of it for Coy was that it never resolved into anything he could say out loud without sounding like a fool. But the count kept going wrong, and now that he'd let the thing in, he couldn't help lining it up. He went back over his years in his mind, and it seemed to him, though he'd thrown most of the pages away and couldn't prove it, that the days the count went wrong were more often than not the Forney Creek days, the days he carried the Esteps to Sooty Coffee. Not always, but more often than chance. As if the trouble in his numbers lived in that cove, at that grave, in that family. And once he'd thought that, he started to watch the Esteps on the days he carried them, watch them the way you watch a card sharp's hands, trying to catch the trick. He never could. That was the maddening thing. He'd count them on in the morning at the landing, Icy and Burl and whoever was with them that year. Count them careful, look right at them, print names, and he'd carry them across. And at the cove, he'd land everybody, and they'd all hike up to the cemetery, and he'd sit with the boat. And in the evening, they'd all come down, and he'd count them off. And the Esteps were always there, coming down last, usually, quiet, thanking him. He never caught them not there. He never caught the count going wrong in a way he could pin on them specifically. It was always at the level of the whole day's number, a heaviness or a lightness of one that he couldn't trace to any single person. The Esteps were solid. They stood on his boat. He felt the boat settle when they stepped on. They were as real as anybody. And still the number wouldn't come out right, and still they didn't age, and still there was no such thing as a living Estep anywhere but on his boat one day a year. There was one year, and this is close to the last of it, where he tried to force it. He'd worked himself up to it all winter. That spring on the Forney Creek day, he decided he was going to account for the Esteps and nobody else. Just watch them and only them. Catch them boarding, catch them landing, hold them in his eye the entire day and see what his own eyes would tell him. And the way he told it, the day went wrong in a manner he never could describe to my satisfaction, or I think to his own. He said he counted them on that morning, and he was watching for the Esteps particular, and he saw them come. Icy and Burl, and I think 2 others that year, saw them step down onto the pontoon, felt the boat take their weight, wrote the names. He said he was sure of them boarding, but he said that all the way across the water that morning, whenever he'd glance back to fix them in his eye, he'd have trouble finding them in the crowd on the boat, and then he'd find them, and they'd be sitting quiet where they'd always been, and he'd think he'd just looked in the wrong place. And up at the cemetery, it was the same. He kept losing them among the graves and the hemlocks, and then finding them again at Sooty Coffee's stone, exactly where they should be. And he could never say afterward whether he'd truly lost sight of them, or whether an anxious old man had just been fooling himself with the coming and going of light under the trees. And that evening, he counted everybody off, watching for the Esteps, hardest of all, and he saw them come down. And he was certain he saw them step off the boat at the landing and walk up toward the trucks with their empty buckets. He was certain. And the count came back, one heavy, one more off the boat than had gone on. And when he did the sheet that night, trying to find the extra, going down the names one at a time, there was a name on it he did not remember writing and could not read, the ink smeared as if by a wet thumb. Sitting in the list right below Burl Esteps, and no matter how he turned it in the lamplight, he could not make out what it said, only that it was a name, and that it was there, and that it made the number come out even, 1 for 1, on and off, all accounted for, if you counted the name he couldn't read as a person. That was the year Coy Buckner stopped keeping the count. He didn't quit the boats, not right then. He kept ferrying the decoration crowds for a few more springs, because the families needed carrying, and there wasn't anybody else who knew the water like he did. And it would have been a hard thing to explain, and what was he going to say? But he stopped counting. He'd hand out the life jackets and load them up and carry them across and bring them home, and he would not stand at the front and touch each shoulder, and he would not do the number at the top of the page or the bottom, because Emmett had told him he didn't want to know that number, and Coy had decided at last that Emmett was right. He figured if he didn't count, then it couldn't come out wrong, and if it couldn't come out wrong, Then he didn't have to know how many of the people he carried across that cold, green water every spring were the kind of people who could sign a name in the morning and be no such person by night, or come to a young girl's grave for 80 years without aging, or step onto a boat and settle it with their weight, and still not be quite where your eye went looking for them. He carried the S-steps a few more times, to Sooty Coffee, unchanged, and then he was too old to run the boat anymore, and he handed it off, and he told the man who took it over the same thing Emmett had told him, word for word, that he didn't want to know that number, and the man had laughed the way Coy had probably laughed at Emmett once, and Coy let him laugh. The decoration days still happen. Every spring the boats still cross Fontana Lake and carry the families up into the coves to their people's graves, up above the drowned towns, up above the drowned road that goes nowhere, because the road they were promised was never built, and there is still only the one way across, and there has only ever been the one way. Somebody still stands at the landing before dawn with the mist coming up off the water in long, slow ropes. And Coy Buckner told me, near the end of the evening, that he doesn't know if that somebody keeps account. He hopes not. He said he drove up to a landing once, a year or two back, on a decoration morning, just to sit in his truck and watch the boat load and go, and he saw the families going down to the water with their flowers, and he saw the boat pull out into the channel and get small and then get swallowed in the mist. And he said he watched the far shore a long time, where the coves were, where Sooty Coffee is, and he had the thought, sitting there, that he'd carried those two across more times than he'd carried anybody, and that he never once, in more than 20 years, saw them come to the landing before the boat, or leave it after. They were only ever on the water. He'd never seen an S-step on dry land in his life, not once. And he started the truck and drove home, and he has not been back to a landing on a decoration day since. The water's still there. The graves are still up above it, on the far shore, where you can only get by boat. And every spring somebody carries the flowers across, and if they're wise, they don't count too close. And some stories just go on going across, back and forth, and never come out even. There was a poplar at the head of the branch, a big one, and the local men would not cut past it. Marvin Kessler had been on the road crew close to 3 months by then, and he'd never once seen anything stop those men. They'd cut everything else all summer, anything the survey line ran through, oak and hemlock and laurel, whatever stood in the way of the road. And they came up to that poplar with the mattocks and the crosscut saws, and they just stopped. All of them, at the same time, the way a room goes quiet without anybody deciding it should. And Gaither Sizemore, who was their foreman and who hadn't said 10 words all that morning, said even less now. He stood and he looked at the tree for a while. Then he said the road would go round it. And the young Forest Service man said the road would go straight, that the line was the line. And Gaither looked at him and didn't answer. And Marvin, who was a city boy and understood almost nothing about where he was, understood at least that one thing right then, which was that Gaither Sizemore was afraid. It took him a lot longer to work out of what, and longer than that to stop being able to sleep on account of it. Marvin Kessler was from Cincinnati, and I want you to hold on to that, because the whole shape of this thing is a man from a city being set down in a place where he could not read a single sign, and among men who could read every one of them and would not say out loud what they read. He was one of the Civilian Conservation Corps boys. You've maybe heard of the CCC, or seen the stonework, because it's all over the country. The trails and the shelters and the fire towers and the park roads built in the 30s by young men out of work. When the Depression hit bottom, there were hundreds of thousands of them. Boys, 18, 19, 20, no jobs, no prospects, hanging around the cities with nothing, and the government stood up this program to take them out of the cities and put them to work in the woods. They ran it half like the Army and half like the Forest Service. The Army had the camps, the barracks, and the mess hall, and the reveille, and the discipline, and the Forest Service, or the Park Service, where it was a park, had the actual work, the projects, the roads and the trails and the tree planting and the fire lines. 200 men to a camp, more or less, in long wooden barracks out in the middle of nowhere. $30 a month, and you kept 5 and they sent 25 home to your people, which, for a lot of families in those years, was the only money coming in the door. Marvin signed up in Cincinnati in the spring, a city kid who'd never spent a night outside a building in his life. And they put him on a train, and the train took him down into eastern Kentucky, into the Cumberland Mountains, up in the country toward the Virginia line, Harlan and Leslie County country, and let him off in a world he had no words for. He said the mountains scared him before anybody in them did. He wasn't used to being closed in like that. Cincinnati is a wide open sky over a river valley, and this was the opposite. These long steep mountains crowded right up against each other. Pine Mountain and the Black Mountain country, hollows so narrow and deep the sun didn't get down into some of them till the middle of the day. Everything green and dripping and close. The camp was up one of those hollows, and the work that year was building a truck road, a forest road, up and over into the next drainage. part of the reforestation they were doing all through there after the timber companies and the coal had torn the country up. They were putting the woods back and putting roads in to manage it, and Marvin's crew was the road crew, cutting and grading a roadbed foot by foot up the mountain by hand and by blasting. That's the thing people forget about that work. It was handwork, axes and mattocks and picks and shovels and the crosscut saws, muscle, all day. But when they hit rock, and up in those mountains you hit rock, they blasted. They had powdermen, dynamite, and they'd drill and set charges and blow the rock out, and then the crews would muck it out by hand and grade the bed. So the road didn't just get cut, it got dug, and where the mountain wouldn't give, it got blasted open. I want that clear, the blasting, because it matters to where this went. Now the CCC was mostly city and town boys like Marvin, green as grass, couldn't swing an axe without hurting themselves. So the program did a smart thing, which was they hired local men to lead them. There was a name for it, local experienced men, LEMS, and they were exactly that. Men from those very mountains who knew the woods and the rock and the tools, hired on to run the crews and teach the young ones and keep them from killing themselves. The LEMS were the backbone of the work, and Marvin's crew had 3 of them that mattered. There was Isam Caudle and there was Pless Bowling, who were the 2 steadiest hands on the crew, older men, quiet, who could do more with a mattock in an hour than the whole rest of the crew could in a day. And over them, the foreman, was Gaither Sizemore. Gaither was a hard man to know. Marvin said he was the most respected man on that crew and one of the quietest men he ever met, a lean, still man past 50, who'd grown up in those hollows and whose people had been in them longer than there were records to say. He wasn't unkind. He was just a man who used words the way you'd use money in a lean year, only when you had to. The city boys were half afraid of him and completely dependent on him because he knew everything, where the rock was, where the water was, how to lay a road on a mountain so it wouldn't wash out the first hard rain. And he taught them without seeming to teach them, by doing it in front of them and letting them watch. Marvin got put under him early, being useless and needing the most watching, and so Marvin spent that whole summer closer to Gaither Sizemore than most, and that's why it's Marvin's account I have, because Marvin was the outsider, standing right next to the man who knew. The road ran fine for a good while. All spring and into the summer they cut and blasted and graded their way up the mountain, and it was hard and it was ordinary and nothing was wrong. And then the line started bending toward the head of a certain branch, a little steep hollow that came down off the ridge, and that's when Marvin first noticed that the local men had opinions about where the road went, opinions they expressed by their hands and their feet more than their mouths, because the survey line, the line the Forest Service man had run, went straight up the head of that branch and over. And the local men didn't want to go up the head of that branch. It started small, the way all of it started small. Gaither would find reasons to work the road wide of the branch head, to swing it out along the side of the hollow instead of driving it straight up, and he'd give reasons a roadman would give. The ground's better here, the grade's easier here, and we'll lose less to washing over here, and they were good reasons. And the Forest Service man mostly let him have it because Gaither knew roads and the Forest Service man was young and knew he knew roads. But Marvin noticed that all of Gaither's good reasons happened to steer the road away from one particular spot at the head of that branch, and that the closer the work got to that spot, the fewer words Gaither used, and the more the other local men, Isam and Pless, watched the head of the branch when they thought nobody was looking. There was a poplar up there, the big one, and around it, when Marvin finally got up close enough to see, there were stones, old stones, moss on them piled and set, not natural. A low rough ring or cairn of them half sunk in the leaf mold around a place where the ground dipped a little. A shallow depression under the poplar that you wouldn't have looked at twice if the stones hadn't been there. It was the kind of thing that meant nothing to a boy from Cincinnati and clearly meant a great deal to the men from those hollows because they would not go near it and they would not cut near it. And the day the crew came up level with it and stopped at the poplar and would not go past, that was the day Marvin understood Gaither was afraid. I told you about that day at the start. The Forest Service man said straight. Gaither said around. Gaither didn't argue it. He just said around and set the crew to swinging the road wide, and the young man led him that time. And Marvin, curious the way you're curious about a thing you can't read, went to Isam Caudle later, off to the side, and asked him what was up there, what the stones were, why nobody'd cut past the poplar. And Isam, who was not an unfriendly man, looked at Marvin a while, the way those men looked at you when you'd asked something you had no business asking and didn't even know you'd done it. And then Isam said, just a little. He said that was old ground. He said it had been kept a long time, longer than anybody, that his own grandfather had helped keep it, and his grandfather's people before that, and that it wasn't a thing you dug at or cut at or went poking around. He said, some ground you leave be. And Marvin, being a city boy and thinking like a city boy, asked him, leave be from what? What's up there? And Isam Caudle looked at him and said, that's just it, and didn't finish, and went back to work, and would not say another word about it, that day or any other. That's just it. Marvin turned that over for years. It wasn't that Isom wouldn't tell him what was up there. Marvin came to think, later, that Isom couldn't have told him if he'd wanted to, that Isom didn't know what was up there either, that none of them knew, that the whole point of the keeping was that nobody knew and nobody was ever supposed to find out, and that the not knowing was the very thing being handed down, generation to generation, along with the stones and the poplar and the flat refusal to dig. For a while the road stayed swung wide and it was all right. But the CCC ran on schedules and lines in Washington, and the road was supposed to go where the line said, and a young Forest Service technician who wants to make his name does not want to explain to his superiors why his road wandered off the surveyed grade to go around a poplar tree and a pile of rocks, because some local men didn't like it, so the pressure came back to straighten it. Bring it back to the line, drive it up the head of the branch the way the survey said, and blast the ledge out up there that was making it hard, and quit wasting fill on the long way around. And that order didn't come from any one man you could really point at. It came down. The young technician was passing along what his people wanted, and his people were passing along what the schedule wanted, and the schedule was a thing that lived in an office somewhere none of them had ever been. And so there was nobody in the end who had decided that the road should go up the head of that branch. It was just where the line went, and the line came from above, and above had no face. And the closer they worked back toward the head of that branch, the quieter Gaither Sizemore got. I keep saying that, and I mean it plainer than it sounds. It was a real thing you could measure. In the spring, Gaither would give you a sentence or two when he needed to. By the middle of the summer, working back toward that branch, he'd stopped giving sentences. He'd point, he'd nod. He'd put his hand on a tool and show you and walk off. Marvin said there were whole days Gaither didn't speak a word to anybody. Days he just worked hard, harder than the young men, like a man trying to get through something by pushing straight into it with his body, and his face got a set to it that the men learned to stay clear of. And it wasn't sulking. And it wasn't the young technician getting under his skin. It was something else, and the other local men had it too, in their own ways. Isom stopped whistling, which he'd done all spring. Plus Bowling got a habit of stopping every so often, and standing dead still and looking up the branch, just looking, and then going back to work like he hadn't. There was a dread coming into those men, and it was coming in as the road came in, foot by foot, up that hollow. The small wrong things started around then too, and I'll give them to you the way Marvin gave them to me, which is plainly, because he was plain about them. And because he always said the same thing about each one, which was that any single one of them was nothing. The mules wouldn't go up the branch. They used mules for hauling, and a couple of times they needed the mules up toward the head of that hollow, and the mules balked, planted their feet, and would not go. And a mule balks. That's nothing. Mules are contrary. But these were good, steady mules that went everywhere else, and they would not go up that branch. And after the second time, the skinner just quit trying, and they packed by hand. Tools went missing up there. Not down at the main work, up at the head of the branch. A mattock left overnight would be gone in the morning, or a saw, or a shovel, things that don't walk off. And it happened enough that the men stopped leaving anything up there overnight and carried it all down every evening. And nobody said out loud why they'd started doing that. They just started. And there was a night, Marvin said. One night when the whole barracks heard something. He was careful about this one, more careful than the others, because he knew how it sounded. He said it wasn't a scream and it wasn't an animal, that everybody in camp knew every animal there was by then, the panthers and the owls and all of it, and this wasn't any of them. He said it was low, and it came from up the mountain, from the direction of the work, from up toward the head of that branch, and it went on longer than a sound like that should, a long, low sound with no animal in it that he could name. And the whole barracks lay awake and nobody said anything, and in the morning nobody talked about it, and the local men who bunked separate, some of them, wouldn't meet anybody's eye. He never could say what it was. He said the honest thing, which was that a mountain at night makes sounds a city boy can't account for, that maybe it was wind in a way he didn't know, or rock, or water, and that he'd told himself all of that at the time. But he also said that the local men had heard it too, and that whatever a city boy will explain away, those men would not, and that after that night the dread in them wasn't quiet anymore, it was right up at the surface. Plus Bowling was the one who said the most, in the end, and he said it to Marvin because Marvin was young and green, and Pless maybe felt he ought to warn him, being that Marvin didn't know enough to be afraid on his own. It was near the end, when the road was almost up to the head of the branch, and they all knew the blasting was coming. Pless got Marvin aside, and he told him, low, that they were fixing to do a bad thing, digging up there, and that Marvin should keep back from it when it came. Keep well back, whatever they told him to do. And Marvin asked him, straight, the same question he'd asked Isom, what's up there? And Pless didn't answer that either, but he answered a little around it. He said it had been closed a long time, that it had been closed and kept closed since before his people came into that country, and his people had been there a long time, and that they'd found it already closed and had understood that it was to stay closed, and had helped keep it closed, and their fathers before them. And that there'd been men in every generation whose job it partly was to make sure it stayed shut, to look in on it and shore it up when it needed it. And Gaither, Pless said, Gaither Sizemore was one of those men now. That was Gaither's. That was on him, and that was why Gaither had gone the way he'd gone. Because it was Gaither's charge to keep it shut, and here was the government fixing to dig it open, and there wasn't a thing in the world Gaither could do to stop it. And it was killing him. That was the most anybody ever told Marvin. Closed a long time. Kept closed on purpose, by hand, by men whose work it was, generation after generation. And the government was going to open it. They got to it in the early fall. The road came up to the head of the branch, and the ledge was there that had to be blasted right at the poplar, right over the dip in the ground, and the old stones, and the order was to take it out. Gaither didn't fight it anymore by then. Marvin said that was almost the worst part, that Gaither had stopped fighting it, had gone past fighting it into some still place, and just did his job, laid it out. Because if it was going to be done, he'd have it done right. Or maybe because a man who's watched a thing he swore to protect get destroyed will sometimes go numb and just move his hands. The powdermen drilled and set the charges. They cleared everybody back, and Marvin remembered Pless's warning and got back farther than he was told to, back down the road behind a cut, and they blew it. And what the blast opened up was not just rock. The charge took out the ledge, and it took out the dip in the ground under the poplar, and where the dip had been, there was a hole. Not a hole the dynamite made. A hole the dynamite uncovered. The blast had blown the cover off of something that had been covered, and the men went up to muck out the rock the way they did after every blast. And they came to the edge of it, and they stopped, and Marvin came up behind them and looked, and what he saw was this. Under where the ground had been, under the dip and the stones, there was fill. Deliberate fill. Layers of it. Dry-laid stone, stones fitted together by hand without any mortar, the way you'd wall something up, and old timbers in among the stone, hand-hewn timbers gone black and soft with age, and below that older fill, and below that fill older still, layer on layer, so that you could see, right there in the blasted open side of it, that this hole had been filled and capped and sealed, not once, but many times, over and over, across a stretch of years so long the bottom layers had rotted to nothing and been sealed over again by the next generation. And the next, hundreds of years of it maybe, hands and hands and hands of men carrying stone up that branch and fitting it in and covering it and going home, and doing it again when it settled, keeping it filled, keeping it shut, generation after generation after generation, exactly the way Pless had said. And the blast had opened it. Below the fill, where the charge had broken through, there was a gap. A dark place where the fill hadn't been reached, an opening going down into the mountain, and out of it, Marvin said, came cold air. Cold on a warm fall day, a steady breath of cold air coming up out of that gap, and a smell he didn't have a word for and didn't want one, and the men standing at the edge of the hole looking down into the dark of it, not one of them moving, not one of them saying a word. He never saw what was down there. I want to be clear about that, because it's the truth, and because it's the whole of it. Nobody saw down there. Nobody went down there. Marvin stood at the edge of an opening in the ground that men had spent centuries keeping closed. And it had been broken open right in front of him, and there was cold air and a smell and a dark going down. And that is every single thing he ever knew about what was in it. Whatever the keeping had been keeping, it kept it secret, even then. What he saw was Gaither Sizemore. Gaither came up to the edge and looked down into the broken open hole, into the dark and the cold coming out of it, and Marvin was watching his face, and he said Gaither's face did something he never forgot, and could never quite describe. That it wasn't fear exactly, not anymore, that it was past fear, that it was the face of a man looking at the one thing he'd spent his whole life making sure he would never have to look at. And now here it was, and there was nothing to be done. And Gaither turned around, and for the first time in weeks he spoke clear to the whole crew, and all he said was, Cover it back up, now. And they did. Gaither had them fill it back in that same day, drove them at it, stone and dirt and whatever they had, filled it and packed it and capped it, worked into the dark to get it shut, and Marvin worked alongside them and said he'd never worked so hard or so glad to be working, glad to have his back to that dark and stones in his hands to close it with. They sealed it the way it had been sealed, or as near as one afternoon and a road crew could manage, and Gaither stood over it until it was done. And then the road went around after all. Here's how that part went, and it's the part that fits the pattern of all these things, where the doing gets undone from somewhere above, and nobody will own it. The next day, or within a day or two, an order came down that the road would be rerouted around the head of that branch, not up it. Around it, the way Gaither had wanted from the start. And the reason given was ordinary. The ground at the head of the branch had proved unstable, was the official version, unsuitable for the roadbed. The blasting had shown it was no good, better to swing the grade around. That was the reason on the paper. And maybe that was all it was. But Marvin never believed the reason came from the reason. He believed, though he could never prove a word of it, that Gaither Sizemore or Isom or Pless had gotten word to somebody, that there were men in that country whose business this was in ways that went up higher and quieter than a road crew, older families, and that a word had passed somewhere in a way a city boy would never see, and that the order that came down dressed up as engineering was really that word coming back around, and that the young Forest Service technician passed it along as his own decision, never knowing he'd been steered, and his superiors approved it, never knowing there'd been anything to steer. So the road bent away from the head of the branch, and the reason went into a file, and there was nobody, again, that you could point to and say, that man decided to leave it shut because on the paper it was just bad ground, and bad ground has no face either. Marvin's term ran out that winter, and he didn't sign on again. He went back to Cincinnati. The camp finished the road around the branch and moved on to the next work the way those camps did, and the sea itself lasted only a few more years before the war shut it down and sent all those young men off to a different kind of thing. And the head of that branch, as far as Marvin ever knew, was left the way Gaither had them leave it, filled back in, capped, the poplar over it. The old stones scattered now by the blast, but the thing itself shut again. And somewhere in one of those families, Marvin always figured, some man took up the charge again that Gaither had held and went up and shored it and kept it and his son after him. And it went on being kept the way it had been kept for longer than anybody could say. He told me the thing that stayed with him at the end, and it wasn't the hole or the cold air or the smell, though he never forgot those. It was Gaither. It was that a man had spent his whole life, and his father his, and back, guarding a thing they had never seen and could not name, filling in a hole that they had no idea what was at the bottom of, purely because it had been handed to them that it must stay filled and asking no questions, wanting no answers, wanting only for it to stay shut and to hand it on still shut. Marvin, being a city boy, had wanted to know what was down there his whole life after, and never found out, and never could, and came in his old age to think that wanting to know had been the wrong thing all along, that the not wanting to know was the wisdom of it, that those men had understood something he never would, which was that some things you keep closed, and you don't ask, and you teach your children not to ask, and that is the whole of the job, and it is enough. There's a forest road up there today, up in that country, and if you drove it, you wouldn't think a thing about it. It runs up a mountain, and near the head of a certain branch it bends, swings wide around a piece of ground for no reason you could see, and then straightens out again and goes on over the ridge. Just a bend in a road around some bad ground. That's all it is. That's all anybody would ever tell you it is. They filled it back in and the road went around. And the men who knew went home and didn't talk about it, and their people are still up in that country, some of them. If you asked, they'd tell you it was bad ground. Some ground you leave be. That's not an answer to anything. It's just what they say, and they've been saying it a long time.